Chapter 41, A Poor Showing. The young man wiped the sweat off his forehead with his sleeve for the billionth time. Luckily, it trickled down the enchanted fabric without being absorbed, else he would be soaking by now. At least the robes came with self-cleaning runes. Percy was trudging down the final bridge linking the first and second levels, his eyes half-closed and his breath rugged. The wind caused the flimsy structure to sway every so often, but he'd grown used to it by now, having walked several miles on the bridges already. That said, the exhaustion made keeping his balance more challenging. He briefly considered using his quarterstaff as a walking cane, but that would only take more effort. Let's just treat it as another obstacle to overcome. He shrugged. Today's hunt had been grueling, and the results abysmal. He and Mickey had only managed to kill 14 wasps in total, averaging less than 1 per hour. Evidently, the starry workers were on a whole different level than the drones, both literally and metaphorically. Finding them wasn't that hard. If anything, their larger size made them spottable from further away, but they were slightly less abundant than their weaker relatives, so it worked out about the same. Killing them was a different story, however. The best strategy they had come up with involved Mickey distracting the wasps while Percy fired parting gifts, praying they landed. Despite reducing the size and increasing the quantity of the projectiles, launching 3 smaller daggers with each shot, hitting the beasts came down to sheer luck. He also had to take extra care not to hit his own familiar with the deadly spell, complicating things further. Another issue was that he couldn't keep circulation active all day. Everything had progressed relatively smoothly during the morning, but it all went downhill once he grew too tired to use the technique in the afternoon. The final nail in the coffin was that he had only harvested 12 of the 14 glands, as they had accidentally ruined a couple while fighting the creatures. We made even less nectar than on the ground floor. Percy frowned. Although he had only tested it for a couple of hours, he had estimated they could reliably hunt around 40 drones per day, which would get them about 200 drops of nectar. Today, they had only earned about 180 from the workers. But there's more room for improvement here. The difficulty in killing the red variants was non-existent, so the only issue was finding them. Perhaps they could get better at that after learning the ropes, but they would still be capped by how fast they could travel. Meanwhile, there was more at play on the second level. There, they could also work on their combatability and teamwork to increase their gains. Let's give it a couple of weeks. If we don't improve much, we can consider downgrading. Soon, he reached the gate, waving at the guards who returned the gesture. Entering the settlement, he headed straight towards Freddy's spot, craving another honey roll. However, he paused upon seeing another newsstand that had popped up at some point. This wasn't here last night. Of course, the roads inside the guild's camp were filled with all sorts of stalls with people bartering and trading. Not all were open this late, but plenty still were. That said, there was a reason why this one caught his eye. Percy recognized the owner, a strange phenomenon considering how few people he had met. It was a petite girl dressed in a brand new yellow robe. Her tousled hair was black and only barely reached her shoulders. She wore a pair of glasses too. The drowsy girl from the orientation. But what is she doing? True to the nickname he had given her, she was resting face down on the counter once more. Right next to her, there was a translucent jar with 5 red coins. She clearly hadn't spent any of her allowance yet, nor had she made any effort to earn more. She seems to be serious about not hunting or brewing. Percy shook his head. Next, he glanced down at a hastily made sign she had nailed on the stand. Buying information on the 3rd level. The handwriting was sloppy too. Percy's jaw dropped at the sight. She wanted to buy information with her measly 5 points? What for? If she had no intention of venturing out, then how would it help her? Also, what if people lied to her? She'd just be wasting her money. It's none of my business anyway. I'm sure she'll wise up in a couple of days. Besides, losing a handful of points isn't a big deal. Ignoring her, he continued to Freddy's stall. Hey Percy, any luck out there? The plump guy asked with a smile. Not really. I only managed to kill 7 workers today. He replied, having the number to hide Mickey's involvement. That's quite good for your first proper hunt. A bit better than average, too. Freddy nodded. Really? I thought it was on the lower side. Percy raised an eyebrow. Most people find the best level to hunt at is the one matching their grade. Locating and killing the wasps can be tricky, so newcomers usually average about 5 glands per day. If you have a suitable affinity and with some experience, you can get to 20. Percy frowned. This arrangement would work well for people at yellow. After all, 20 kills on the 3rd level would get them 900 contribution points, which was more than double what they needed. However, this wouldn't cut it for him. Even if he and Mickey improved enough to hunt 20 workers each, they'd only get 600 points, still short of his 2nd dose. Let's not get ahead of myself. For now, I should focus on earning the 1st dose before I run out of elixirs. After that, I can look into alchemy to make the difference. He thanked Freddy for the information and the food before leaving. Just 2 blocks from his house, however, he was rudely shoved aside by a passerby. The hell? The guy didn't bother apologizing or even glancing back. He kept walking next to another person, the two seemingly locked in a heated conversation. Nobody mentioned these things would be so hard to find, the first guy yelled. At least your fire magic is among the best for the job, the other replied. Do you have any idea how annoying it is to toss stones at them until they hit? Both wore yellow robes, and Percy recognized the second guy, the one who hadn't pushed him. He'd also been in his orientation. I guess I'm not the only one having trouble with this. Percy smiled wryly. Of course, these people were much closer to their own targets. They were earning more and needed less. Still, knowing he wasn't alone struggling was a little reassuring. Reaching his house, he took a shower before sitting on his bed. Next, he drank another dose of the elixir, noting he only had 16 vials left. Adding in the ones he could buy with his current income, he calculated they'd last him a month. We need to kill 27 workers per day so that I can sustain 1 core. That should be my current goal. I have to get there in a month. Having made his mind up, he activated soul vision, examining the state of his soul. It's not all bad. The corner of his lips curled up. Despite their subpar performance, the soul mana Mickey had gathered from the wasps had done wonders for Percy's recovery. The crater in his chest had visibly shrunk some more. There was still some distance to cover, but his healing speed would increase too as they raised their hunting efficiency. I can probably generate enough mana to feed my 1st core diluted elixirs already. At this rate, I'll be able to resume sending clones soon. Not only that, but honing his combat skills was a noteworthy benefit in and of itself. Percy would have sought out an environment like the fungal spire to train in, even if his advancement wasn't dependent on it. At the end of the day, adapting his fighting style to his nimble opponents was a welcome challenge. Let's see if I can come up with a couple new spells for this. Chapter 42, Adjusting Tactics. I'm jumping in. Hearing the warning, the crow changed direction at the last second, briefly confusing the wasp. Percy dashed towards it, swinging down his staff. Still, the agile bug caught on quickly enough, dodging the telegraph blow, before lunging forward to deliver a hit of its own. The young man flicked his hand, parrying the stinger. Bending dangerously, the scion weapon appeared about to snap. Percy understood by now that a quarterstaff wasn't great against the creatures. Coming up with a better use for his pure mana was definitely something on his to-do list. That said, this wasn't his focus right now. He stabbed forward with his other hand, the silver point just barely missing the wasp. Damn! I almost got it! He groaned. The insect was about to counterattack, but Mickey dove towards it, nearly clipping its membranous wings with his talons, engaging it into a new round. Activating soul vision, the young man looked at his new weapon again. The shape hadn't changed much, but it was twice as long as before. Perhaps it resembled a rapier. Over the last couple of days, Percy had thought about the greatest shortcomings in his offensive capabilities. While the parting gift packed quite a punch, it was frankly overkill in most situations. The difficulty in landing it coupled with the long preparation time meant he left himself defenseless for much of the fight. If he didn't have a 2nd core to rely on, he would have probably died already. Even if he had found another way to escape from Rick's group, the starry workers would have stabbed him full of holes by now. Consequently, he had come up with two possible solutions. The first was to continue increasing the number of projectiles he could shoot at once. If he gave his spell a wider spread, he'd be able to hit the wasps more frequently. However, it would still leave him powerless between shots. That's why he'd gone with the second solution instead. His current plan was to devise a close combat variant of the parting gift. It wouldn't dissipate after each strike, so his opponents would think twice before approaching, or pay the price. Although it's not perfect either, he frowned. While it would keep the bugs at bay, making him safer, it wouldn't help him land the hits. If anything, it would make it even harder. That said, he reasoned he could amend that with more practice. The soul constructs were weightless, so he could swing them faster than any corporeal weapon. As long as he worked on his timing, he'd be able to slay the starry workers with some well-executed counterattacks. Perhaps a rapier isn't the best shape though. Due to the extreme lethality of his soul mana, he only needed to nick a corner of the bug's souls to defeat them. Even if the first strike didn't kill them, it would stop them in their tracks long enough for him to finish the job. Consequently, a slashing weapon might be more useful than a stabbing one. It wasn't piercing power he lacked. Should I go for a hatchet or cutlass? He didn't like the idea of the former, as he'd have to waste a lot of mana on the handle. The latter sounded better, but he'd still prefer something with a wider blade. Something the wasps couldn't evade so easily. What if I bend the edge a little too? Caw! Mickey complained, snapping him out of his thoughts. Right, I'm going back in. He quickly summoned his weapons, but one looked different. As before, the scuffle ended without success, the wasp dodging the modified spell effortlessly. However, he didn't let it get to him, as he knew realizing his new idea would take a couple more days. Percy grinned, beginning to reform the blade once more, adjusting the shape again. You bastards are in for a nasty surprise. He took a deep breath, as the cyan lines shone underneath his skin. Over the past week, Percy had focused on adapting his parting gift rather than killing as many wasps as possible. Logically, this should have caused their daily gains to drop even more, yet it hadn't. Without realizing, the young man had grown better at maintaining circulation. This had allowed him to fight in his top form for a couple hours longer per day. Today our kill count is going up too. Soul mana gathered in his hand once more, coalescing into a solid. The blade extended and curved and kept extending and curving still. By the time it finished taking shape, Percy had exhausted every last drop of mana in his sternum, his weapon spanning an arc 3 times the radius of his fist. The new version of the parting gift required the full capacity of his core to cast, taking the form of a sickle. Stay out of this one, buddy. Caw. Stomping hard, he bolted towards the wasp. The worker noticed him before he reached it, diving for the counter. Percy sidestepped the stab, feinting with his staff. Not the sharpest tool in the shed, the wasp bought the fake out, flying to one side, as Percy swung the rod for real this time, nearly glancing the bug too. That seemed to have pissed it off, as it launched a barrage of lunges towards him, trying to turn him into a pin cushion. It wasn't hard to evade most of them with his footwork, parrying the rest with the quarterstaff. The construct protested, but it held for now. Another narrow dodge later, the bug seemed to have run out of steam, as it tried to put some distance. Percy didn't let it, instead stepping forward, putting some pressure on the creature with his rod. Realizing it couldn't keep this up, the bug went for another desperate counterattack, forcing Percy to sacrifice the quarterstaff for one last parry. This was it. The attack left the bug staggered. Having anticipated it, Percy's left hand was already on its way to the wasp's side. It tried to pull back diagonally, but he only had to let the weapon travel a few inches horizontally before releasing his grip, letting the sickle spin as it flew towards the creature. The slash didn't make a sound, but the young man didn't miss the bug's silvery soul being cleanly bisected through his soul vision. Percy allowed what remained of his staff to crumble away, but he didn't move. The lifeless carcass of the starry worker crashed on the cap of the giant mushroom, one of its wings nearly snapping as it bent in a weird angle. It's done. He stared at it in disbelief. He wasn't even out of breath yet. The fight had only lasted a few minutes. Of course, he'd already spent a week working towards this, but pinning down the slippery creature by himself, without relying on luck or distractions, had seemed like such a distant goal. But he'd done it. He'd held his own, anticipating the bug's moves, dodging its blows and seizing the right opportunity to strike back. Caw! Caw! Mickey flew over him, sharing in his excitement. Ha 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 ha! The young man burst into laughter. Help yourself, buddy! He gestured to the corpse. There was still plenty he could do to make their trips more efficient, but this was the first massive step forward. He smiled. Let's see how many we can get today. 19! He counted, a shit-eating grin plastered on his face. Percy had just finished squeezing the last of today's glands into a vial. This was their best record so far. This time, he had filled nearly 3 tubes with the precious nectar, indicating he was getting closer and closer to his goal. Naturally, he was still 8 kills short, but that didn't seem so unattainable after what he had achieved over a single week. The new form of the parting gift was extremely effective against the creatures. He had already killed a few with it in both melee range and from a distance, proving it was about as versatile as he'd intended. It was still a pain whenever he threw it and missed, as it left his first core completely empty for a time. Luckily, Mickey could always jump in and keep the bugs occupied until he recovered. It sucks the status hasn't bothered to recognize it though. That said, he had expected that. The new variant wasn't sufficiently different from the original to be listed as a new spell, and neither was it profound enough to be elevated to a refined classification. Although, I suppose it doesn't matter what it's called. Percy shrugged. Tomorrow I'll work on a replacement for the quarterstaff. Chapter 43 Elaine. The atmosphere was somber as the crowd of hundreds stood outside, clad in black robes. A deep silence might have been more appropriate for the occasion, but nobody had let the crickets know to stop chirping, or the birds to avoid carelessly flying over the garden. Perhaps the sky should have looked gloomier too, but Remir's sun still shone brightly, oblivious to the bitter sobs of the grieving mother, and the occasional crackles of firewood snapping in the pyre. Archibald let out a turbid breath, held inside for a touch too long, as he watched Serena, his daughter-in-law, scatter her son's ashes in the wind. Fortunately, Abelak was not here to mourn the boy, having died in the tragedy years ago, along with the other Redborns. Truth be told, Archibald had a personal preference for burials over cremations. The idea of having a grave to visit, a way to keep the deceased always close, just sounded better. In fact, many of the younger families still performed them to this day. Sadly, this wasn't an option for the older ones, like the Avalon House, who had bid farewell to thousands of members over their millennia-long history. If they buried everyone, their mansion would be little more than an island amidst a sea of graves by now. No, the Avalons wouldn't get a grave. They'd all have to settle for a few words in a book, listing their relationships and achievements. The Yellowborns who lived the longest would get a full page. Some, like Archibald himself, might even get a couple. As for the Redborns and Orangeborns who died young, they'd have to make do with a paragraph. Was I wrong? It was precisely because things like this kept happening that he had maintained his distance from the family. He had to be a leader. Could he afford to break down every time he lost somebody? Putting his own emotions aside was what was best for everyone. If anything, it helped reduce losses such as today's. Little good it did Elaine, though. Archibald's interactions with Percy had made him reconsider his stance. Perhaps his role as the cold patriarch of the family served their house well, for the majority of people. But what about those few who received the short end of the stick? If Elaine had been destined to die young, hadn't he deserved a grandpa in his short life? Heck, didn't I deserve to know my grandson before he was gone? Elaine walked over, breaking him out of his thoughts. Her expression was downtrodden. She hadn't spoken a word since Enid helped her back a few days ago, carrying a sack with Elaine's remains in the other hand. She must be blaming herself. He placed his hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. By all accounts, this could still be considered a positive outcome for the family. Elaine, the only Yellowborn in the team, had not only survived, but returned home with a new refined spell. In fact, the pragmatic leader in him should have been overjoyed. Perhaps they should even be celebrating rather than mourning. Yet the mere thought made his stomach churn. "Grandpa, where is Percy? I haven't seen him since I got back." A lump got stuck in Archibald's throat. Breaking more bad news to the girl was the last thing he wanted. "He left a few weeks ago. He should be in the Alchemist's Guild by now." "What? Why? He didn't even say goodbye," she exclaimed, only catching herself a moment later after seeing the others giving her weird looks. "What happened?" she whispered a moment later. "The boy probably grew a conscience." Another voice interjected. A gallant man approached them, the air around him crackling with power as he stopped just a meter away. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elaine scowled at him. "It means you and Father have already spoiled that Redborn for long enough. It's best he tries to pay his own way in the world. He'll fail, of course, but that ought to teach him that precious resources aren't meant for his ilk." Galahad replied in a casual tone, his words sharp like knives. But he wasn't done. "My only worry is that he'll embarrass our house in the eyes of others, but I suppose that's a small price to pay to stop pouring elixirs down the drain." The girl looked ready to snap at her uncle, but Archibald squeezed her shoulder a bit more firmly to stop her. "That's enough, son. This is not the time or the place to be bad-mouthing anyone, let alone your nephew. Besides, I think you might be surprised the next time you meet Percy." He didn't like Galahad's callousness, but it would be hypocritical of him to get angry. After all, he was the one who had molded his son into this, preparing him into a future leader of the house. Strictly speaking, Galahad simply embodied the principles he had taught, nothing more, nothing less. In fact, one might even argue the man adhered to them even more closely than Archibald himself, not allowing compassion to seep into his thought process. Soon, Galahad left. It wasn't until an hour later that the rest of their relatives had too. "Is he going to be all right?" she asked once they were alone in the garden. He nodded. "Don't worry about him. Mickey advanced to Orange and they needed a good place to hunt and earn elixirs. I'm sure they'll thrive there." His words seemed to ease the tension in her eyes, although it wasn't gone entirely. "Elaine, it wasn't your fault. Scorpion Kings are rare, and you couldn't have prevented the ambush," he said after a moment. "But it was my fault. If only I'd learned circulation like you and Percy. Maybe," she stammered, the corners of her eyes glistening with tears. Archibald shook his head. "You wouldn't have even managed to activate it in time to save Elaine. Dwelling on it doesn't help anyone." Elaine didn't say anything, looking down at her feet. The two remained there for another few minutes, before he spoke again. "What are you planning to do now? Will you keep going on missions?" The girl tilted her head up, giving him a firm look. "No." "Perhaps you are right. Even if I had mastered circulation, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. But it might the next time. Or the one after." She clenched her fists before continuing. "I won't leave the mansion until I master it too." Archibald was sitting cross-legged in the inner garden, basking under the gentle radiance of the jade tree. Tossing the prized treasure a glance, he remembered what he had told Percy over a year ago. "I can't give up the tree on a gamble. Let alone you, even if it was Elaine having a second core, I couldn't do that. The tree might help me protect our family next year. Your second core might need centuries to pay off if it ever does." The words already rang hollow as they echoed in his head, making him chuckle. Mere months after he'd said that, Percy had brought circulation back from Huehue, helping him grow far stronger than he ever would through the tree. "Let's not waste it then." Taking a deep breath, he spent a moment appreciating the refreshing fragrance with its minty aftertaste, before guiding the dense mana to his channels. Not long after, green lines glowed under his skin, swirling and branching out like vines. Next, he placed his palms against each other, as he sent a wave of mana rippling through his body, before bouncing off his skin and towards his hands. Soon, a small verdant bubble the size of a pea formed, softly pulsing like a tiny heart. Archibald normally only maintained 60 clones, a mere quarter of what he was capable of, to ensure he still had access to 75% of his mana reserves at any given time. However, now that he had the option of falling back to circulation in a pinch, he had decided to double the number of clones he had on standby. The fact he could create them faster using the technique was a nice bonus too. As for the tree, its main purpose was providing inspiration to life users when developing their spells. Archibald already possessed a top-tier secret art combining his magic and his bloodline, but with circulation and twice as many clones, he was aiming to improve upon it. You kids won't be the only ones getting stronger. Whatever happened, he was the patriarch of the family. He'd keep them all safe at any cost. As for the next poor fool who decided to mess with them, he was in for a nasty surprise. Chapter 44, Opportunity. The thing about quarterstaffs was they were two-handed weapons. Suffice to say, dual-wielding one with a sickle was more than a little awkward. Detrimental even, as it got in Percy's way more often than not, preventing him from landing sure blows with his deadlier tool. Of course, he couldn't help it either. He had considered simply not using it, but the parting gift couldn't block incoming attacks. So the flimsy rod was essentially his only defense against the venomous stingers of the starry workers. Although he was currently working on changing that. I'm not going to bother with a different weapon. The reason he'd even created it to begin with was Mickey's influence still fresh on his mind after Hue Hue, coupled with his first core being unavailable for a long time. The staff had been his only means of attack back then, and it had served him well against the wood goblins. However, his fighting style was still rough around the edges, pieced together out of whatever scraps he could recall from his friend's demonstration. His lacking pair of limbs didn't help much either. Not to mention his grade being much lower than Mickey's too, so the poor excuse of a weapon just wouldn't cut it against the wasps. He reasoned it might be worth revisiting the quarterstaff in the future, after his second core advanced to orange, but for now he'd rather retire it. This time, let's go with something purely defensive. Strictly speaking, his requirements for the replacement were rather modest. He only needed something to block a blow or two, to give him a chance to counterattack. Something that wouldn't get in the way as much. The thought of forming some kind of armor with his pure mana was appealing, though he understood he lacked the capacity to cover his whole body. Instead, he settled for something smaller. Will this even hold? He frowned, looking at his right fist coated in a film of cyan. The construct was poorly made. It was more akin to a cast than a glove right now, as he couldn't twitch a single finger in it, but he'd rather confirm it worked as protection before trying to improve its design. He lifted his eyes, gazing at the bug locked in an aerial confrontation with his familiar, before shrugging. Only one way to find out, I suppose. Activating circulation, he dashed in, telling the crow to disengage. The wasp didn't seem to mind either, more than happy to switch targets. Percy could have dodged the incoming lunge but didn't. Instead, he swung his hand to brush the stinger aside, bracing himself for the worst. Had this been his first day on the second level, he would have missed, as it was much harder to time the parry with such a small surface area than it was with the rod. However, he'd grown used to the bug's movements by now, so the blows connected without issue. He felt the material crumble under the pressure, but it held better than the staff. That was promising, considering his new construct still had plenty of room for improvement. Pushing the wasp away, he tossed a fleeting glance at his hand. The impact had left a deep and wide groove into the construct. Percy directed more mana to repair the cast before taunting the bug to attack again. The two exchanged blows for about 10 minutes, as the young man tested the limits of his new spell, before his stamina began to decline. Only then did he finally seize the next opening, finishing the bug with his sickle. He gestured Mickey to enjoy his meal, before plopping down on the mushroom's cap, analyzing what he'd learned. I don't think it's safe to block a direct stab with it, but brushing the stingers from the side is more than doable. The cast lasted a couple of blows before it came close to shattering. It was only when Percy had pushed for a third in a row without fixing it that he'd risked getting injured. It cost less mana to form and repair, plus it let him use the sickle better too. It's definitely worth working on it, but it's going to take a while to perfect. He'd never made anything this intricate with mana before. The finalized glove would involve lots of interconnected pieces to protect all the joints in his hand without impairing their movement. Still, if I can use both constructs with the same hand, it's going to make everything a lot easier. By nightfall, the duo had taken 20 wasps down, surpassing their previous limit once more. Just over a week after joining the guild, Percy had already reached the higher end of what was viewed as possible for an orange core. He was still far from his goal, but at least his new constructs were much better suited for hunting the bugs. Moreover, he was getting more accustomed to both their fighting style and to keeping circulation active for longer. And his personal kit wasn't the only thing he was working on. Mickey had yet to kill a single wasp by himself, but he was getting closer. His agile opponents were a terrible match for the crow, which was why Percy was still reluctant to let him fight unsupervised. That said, the familiar had not gotten himself in trouble over the last couple of days, having grown better at dodging the last-minute lunges of the bugs. In fact, he'd almost managed to clip their wings a few times. Percy estimated the crow would achieve his first solo kill before long, at which point they could split up and adjust their strategy. Entering the settlement, his attention was drawn to a crowd that had gathered around somebody. He counted a couple dozen people, most of them in yellow robes, not very surprising as they made up the majority of the guild members. Still, he spotted a handful of green and orange cores too. What's this about? Percy raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. Approaching them, he noticed everyone held a leaflet, chatting loudly. Must be a good thing to get them so excited. In fact, they seemed to be in such a good mood they didn't even frown upon seeing him, instead letting him pass unobstructed. Okay, now it's getting weird. The person at the center of the crowd, a blue core holding the stack of leaflets, handed him one with a smile. Free introductory lesson to alchemy? Percy's eyes widened as he read the heading aloud. Seriously? The guy nodded. Normally, each lesson costs about 1,000 contribution points, but the guild likes to sponsor them every now and then to encourage people to get into it. After all, alchemists are precious, and we need as many as we can get. Percy smirked. Then why even charge people in the first place? Because this isn't a charity. Those giving the lessons are just regular members of the guild, and they expect proper compensation for their time. The man sighed before continuing. That said, I do think my fellow alchemists should strive to be a little more selfless for everyone's sake. Teaching is even more lucrative than brewing. You can make tens of thousands per day doing it, but you need to be an experienced alchemist already to qualify. I guess some of them are either a tad too greedy or they just don't want to build up the competition. Percy nodded, albeit reluctantly. It's not like he didn't understand the concept, but it really made it difficult for people like him to get into the field. Aren't there any books on the topic? He asked. Yes, there are plenty in the library, free to read. They cover the basics, but without guidance, it'll take you 10 times longer to learn. Plus, the priciest part of alchemy is the ingredients, not the lessons. That made sense. All these yellows wouldn't have trouble saving up 1,000 points, but if they had to waste months' worth of nectar before they got any good at it, it would indeed be a huge barrier of entry. Anyway, are you interested in signing up? The blue core asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Yes. When is it? Percy didn't hesitate. Perhaps he couldn't afford to become a proper alchemist just yet, but it wouldn't hurt to learn more now that the opportunity presented itself. The knowledge might influence his future plans, after all. Tomorrow morning. Just show up at this building at 10. The guy indicated a certain spot on the leaflet on a hand-drawn map of the guild. Percy thanked him before leaving. Besides, I could use a break from hunting. Chapter 45, Introduction to Alchemy. Percy struggled to find a seat. The lecture theater was packed to the brim with people. Naturally, the orange cores like him were meant to sit at the very back, but even those rows were full. Shrugging, he picked the least crowded corner to stand. It wasn't the most comfortable solution, but he wouldn't have trouble hearing the lecturer. Soon, a man in blue robes walked in. He was actually the same guy who'd given him the leaflet. It was weird for one at that level to waste time advertising his own lecture. Couldn't he have paid somebody to do it? Then again, He did seem passionate about teaching. "Good morning, everyone," the guy said. Percy paid more attention to his lecturer's appearance today. He looked middle-aged, which meant he was probably an Orangeborn who'd lived for several centuries already. "I should have been more respectful last night," he realized. "Judging by your presence here, it's safe to assume you're all beginners, so I'll start with the basics. First of all, the field of alchemy contains more than just the elixirs we know and love. It essentially spans any potions, poisons, or medicine brewed with natural ingredients." Percy nodded, having heard that before. However, most of those things are secondary products of alchemy. Even the best healing potions can't hold a handle to a yellow core's life mana. Similarly, the most potent venoms and poisons we can concoct won't do much to one of the strongest mages. If you want to assassinate a blue, you're better off just using a starry commander's venom. He chuckled before continuing. "And if you're above orange, you're unlikely to get sick, meaning even medicine isn't particularly useful." The room broke into some chatter. "I know what you're all thinking. If these things are so ineffective, then why would anybody bother? And you're not wrong. While there is a place for these products in any noble family's warehouse, they are but secondary pursuits for bored alchemists with too much money and time in their hands. I would advise you to not bother with them for now. Consequently, we aren't interested in anything but elixirs during this lecture." The young man shrugged. Hearing that alchemy was so underdeveloped on Remir was a little sad, but this arrangement suited him just fine. After all, the Avalon House was full of people with the life affinity, so they had even less need for these auxiliary resources than others. Although, I suppose they'd still be somewhat useful for me due to my lower grade. In any case, the first thing you need to understand about elixirs is how they work. Does anyone know? A brave girl in a yellow robe raised her hand. "They break down the impurities in our cores over time, allowing them to reform at a higher grade." The lecturer smiled. This was indeed common knowledge. Yes, the elixirs owe this miraculous property to their main ingredient, the nectar you've all probably come across by now. But can somebody tell me what that is? This time, nobody answered. Everyone in the room had likely hunted the wasps before, yet nobody seemed to understand what exactly made them so special. "Wait. The wasps? Don't tell me." Simply put, the nectar is the only known example of beast mana capable of existing for an extended period of time outside a beast's body. People have tried to make elixirs out of beast cores, but nobody has ever succeeded. At least, not on Remir. Sharp breaths were drawn across the room. It was well understood that beasts refine their cores naturally by eating, without needing any external resources. Evidently, this was because they already possessed the main ingredient of the elixirs within their very cores. As it turned out, alchemists did nothing more than imitate them, harnessing their ability for humanity's sake. "Sir, if that's true, then how do other races advance their grades? Are there starry wasps on every world?" somebody asked. "That's an excellent question. I'm not a member of the Divine Order, so what I can say with certainty on the topic is rather limited. Still, as far as I know, starry wasps are native to Remir." The lecturer replied. "Then how?" another person asked. "Well, every world has different resources and natural treasures. Some are unlucky enough they lack the means of advancing, while others have their own methods. I'd wager most of those methods involve an alternative source of beast mana, however." This explanation made another thing click in Percy's mind. So that's why the fungal spire is considered so important. It's our only practical means of advancement, and there are races who don't even have something similar. The young man developed some newfound appreciation for the colossal mushrooms above their heads. "Okay, so now that we've established that, the question is, how do we process the nectar into elixir?" the lecturer asked. "I've heard there are multiple recipes," somebody said. The alchemist nodded. "Indeed, while the nectar is irreplaceable, all the other ingredients have several alternatives with similar functions. It all comes down to transforming the nectar from raw beast mana, which would only run berserk inside your cores and injure you, into something stable, which will harmlessly cleanse away the impurities alone. Strictly speaking, you only really need to focus on a single recipe and strive to get good at it, although it can be useful to come in contact with a couple more, for when you have limited access to the ingredients you need. Still, most approaches are rather similar, so it's not that hard to switch to a different recipe once you understand the process. Percy felt the urge to laugh. All this time, alchemy had sounded like a mystical and profound profession. But, according to everything they had been taught today, didn't it all seem rather inane? The potions, poisons, and medicines were borderline useless, and even the elixirs merely involved harvesting a single raw ingredient they were lucky enough to find on Remier, transforming it into a slightly different form. If the fungal spire was destroyed, wouldn't that leave all the alchemists without a job overnight? But he shook his head. Obviously, the actual brewing process must be complicated, or it wouldn't be so hard to do it. The lecturer's next words confirmed that. There is one reliable metric that can be used to define an alchemist's skill: their brewing yield. Simply put, this is just a percentage indicating how many drops of elixir they can produce out of 100 drops of nectar. Percy ran the calculation in his head. As far as he could tell, the finished product was 4 times as expensive. Some of you seem to have mated it out already. Indeed, the turning point that qualifies somebody into a full-fledged alchemist is a 25% yield. That's the cutoff where you stop losing money as you brew. The most talented and experienced alchemists in the guild can boast of yields as high as 56%. For anyone wondering, my personal best is only at 44%. The young man had to swallow his saliva to avoid drooling. Didn't that mean their lecturer nearly doubled his money every time he brewed a batch? It's still a time-consuming process, so there's a limit to how much elixir we can brew per day. Our output is still lower than the input and also lower than Remier's needs, which is why we need more alchemists in the guild. If we could convert all the available nectar with a 45% yield, we might have enough for everyone on Remier, including the Redborns. Now, this bit of information was even more shocking to Percy. His whole life, he'd suffered from his low grade, preventing him from advancing as fast as others. If it hadn't been for this shortage, he would have reached Orange 5 years sooner. And the lecturer claimed it could all be solved if they just bothered to train a few more alchemists. Then, why the hell don't you? Percy struggled to keep his thoughts to himself. The lecturer sighed. Despite what my idealistic words might suggest, this is easier said than done. It will take you a few months and a lot of wasted nectar before your first successful batch of elixir. Even then, you're unlikely to start with a yield higher than 15%. It won't be until the end of the year you get to 25%, and it only keeps getting harder. You'll get to about 30% if you keep at it for another year or two. Reaching 40% is usually a matter of decades and 50% centuries. Perhaps, the white cores leading the great houses, or the gods of the divine order could surpass that, having lived for tens of millennia. But their time is much more valuable spent elsewhere than brewing elixirs. The new influx of information did calm Percy down. Evidently, they'd need to train an army of blue-cord alchemists for centuries to provide for everyone. And for what? Just so that Redborns like him would get elixirs? They still wouldn't live past yellow. It wasn't worth the time. But he'd heard another thing of interest. A 30% yield was a realistic goal after a couple of years. That was already enough to make a profit. As soon as I can sustain one core, I'll start siphoning the excess time and points into alchemy. Chapter 46, An Idea. It was early afternoon by the time the alchemist's lecture ended. Advertised as a mere introduction, it didn't really delve into the topic too deeply. After explaining the basic concepts, the guy talked about a few of the most popular recipes, giving them an overview of how the secondary ingredients worked and what tools they needed to use. Percy did feel some anticipation. Not only due to the stacks of contribution points waiting at the other end of his alchemical journey, but also because the whole thing seemed fun. The idea of playing around with magic juices and challenging himself to increase his yield sounded like something he would enjoy. Still, he had to rein in his excitement until he raised the funds to actually dip his toes into the field. Better get back to hunting then. Half the day was gone, but that was no excuse to slack for the rest of it. Caw! Apparently, Mickey agreed, as he'd been urging him for some time. I know. I'm on the way already. Nearing the gate, he saw the drowsy girl's stand was still there, over a week after he first spotted it. The owner was too, sleeping on the counter as usual. Has she not given up yet? I can't tell if she's the laziest or the most persistent person I know. Probably both. For many days, nobody had paid her any attention, although Percy did notice her coins were gone last night. And since then, she'd nailed a new smaller sign, adding more words to the advertisement. Buying and selling information on the 3rd level. So that was her brilliant plan? Purchasing information from experienced hunters to sell to newcomers? Something like where the best spots for hunting were, or how to find and kill the starry soldiers more efficiently. Percy didn't know if anyone would take her up on that. It sounded a bit iffy to spend money on. She should have at least bothered to make a new sign instead of patching it. He shook his head. Half an hour later, he met up with Mickey somewhere on the 2nd level. Not the same place as yesterday. They liked to switch things up every day to let the bugs repopulate. Percy wasn't sure it mattered, as the interior of the spire was supposedly filled with them. More were constantly deployed outside to harvest the dense mana from the mushrooms and to bring back nectar to the nest. Suffice to say, he doubted they would run out anytime soon. Still, he could use any advantage he could get. However, they didn't begin hunting just yet, as Percy wanted to test an idea he came up with during the lecture. Mickey, can you try passing me some of your mana through our link? The crow tilted its head in confusion. Caw? Mickey hadn't eaten anything all morning, so he lacked the soul mana to send. Not the one you get when you eat. The one from your core, Percy explained. While beast mana couldn't normally leave one's body or form regular spells, it could still freely circulate through its owner's channels, passively nourishing their flesh. This was the source of the beast's strength after all. After learning that nectar was essentially just beast mana that could be transferred outside, Percy had considered the possibility of taking advantage of the ethereal cord to achieve something similar. Of course, even if it worked, he wasn't sure how to benefit from it. The alchemist had already told them they couldn't purify their cores with raw beast mana. He'd have to find a way to process it into an elixir inside his body. Still, he was curious enough to give it a shot. Took some guidance from him, but Mickey eventually understood the task. Through mana sense, the young man observed the orange glow leave the crow's sternum, moving towards the connection. However, nothing happened. It just accumulated there with nowhere to go. Unsure whether Mickey had done something wrong or if this was just a peculiarity of the beast mana, Percy next tested whether he could send his own mana to the familiar. Transferring a trickle of soul mana worked, confirming the ethereal cord was a two-way connection, but it didn't accept any of his pure mana either. I suppose it makes sense. It's linking our souls together, so why would it allow any other type to pass? He shrugged, not too disheartened. Caw, caw. Mickey was getting more impatient, sending him an image of a starry worker he'd just spotted. Percy activated circulation before gathering the cyan mana into his right hand, resuming work on his new project. Today, he'd focus on forming the glove with an open hand, increasing its surface area. As soon as everything was in order, he engaged the worker, testing his spell's durability as he looked for an opening to finish the creature. A few minutes later, it was lying motionless on the surface of the mushroom, both its core and nectar gland already harvested. Mickey had flown ahead to scout for their next target, as Percy sat next to the carcass, eyeing it in contemplation. You're some really special things, aren't you? His world's survival hinged entirely on these bugs. If they went extinct, everyone on Remir would be stuck at the grade they were born with. Perhaps they could try other means of cleansing their cores, but they'd be lucky if they even advanced once in their lives that way. But more than his world's situation, Percy couldn't help but consider what this meant for him. Would he have to stay in the Alchemist's Guild his whole life? Even if he managed to provide for his two cores eventually, what would happen when he left? He couldn't exactly take the wasps with him. Then he creased his brow. Or can I? His thoughts lingered on the ethereal cord linking him to Mickey for a moment. He hadn't created the familiar with the intention of raising his own strength. It had all been an accident, brought upon by his desperate attempt to save his friend. However, the advantages the crow brought him were undeniable. Percy would be lying if he said he hadn't considered creating more of them in the past year. After all, how powerful would he be if he could cultivate an army of green or even blue beasts, all loyal to him? It would take even less time than reaching those grades himself. The only reason he hadn't tried it yet was that his soul hadn't been in a good enough state before now. But that was swiftly changing with every soul Mickey devoured. And what if my next familiar is a starry wasp? Not only would he have another companion to fight alongside him, but he'd also have his personal nectar factory. Its production wouldn't be much at red or orange, but what about green or blue? Maybe he could sustain his cores indefinitely one day. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. That said, there were many details he needed to figure out to make this work, as his first success had been a bit of a fluke. For example, could he injure a wasp and shove a part of his soul inside it to create a familiar? It didn't seem to be that simple because that tended to produce regular clones in his experience. From what he'd learned, newborn souls were more malleable than developed ones, making them easier to meld with. That's why the Morai baby had not given him as much trouble as Mickey had, and why the crow chick had proven a suitable host for his familiar. That only raised more questions, however. Where would he even get a starry wasp egg? Would he need to venture into the depths of the fungal spire? That was a place filled with beasts at blue or even higher. Not just that, but entering it was a serious crime. And even then, it wasn't guaranteed to work. The crow egg had produced a familiar, but the Morai baby had simply died as a short-lived clone. Was it because the latter had been in a worse condition to begin with? Or was it because he brought another passenger along, Mickey? In the case of the bird, he'd need to come up with answers to all those questions if he was to succeed, which led to another problem. Baldy and Elaine aren't here to take care of me if I mess up. I should probably stick to regular clones for a while until I'm sure I know what I'm doing. Having already lost a ton of time due to his reckless experiments with his soul, Percy was going to take this slow. Besides, I won't need the new familiar until it's time to leave the guild. Chapter 47 Healed. A month went by in a flash. Percy and Mickey had grown a lot better at hunting the wasps, but today he didn't care about that. Something else was going through his mind as he sat on his bed, gazing down at his soul. It's finally healed. Well, sort of. It had stopped absorbing more mana, although it wasn't back to 100% yet. The hole in his chest had mostly closed, but not completely, leaving a circular scar about the width of a strawberry right where the ethereal cord linked him to Mickey. I suppose this is as good as it's going to get. It didn't look like it would recover entirely, as a part of him still existed within the bird. Perhaps he could fix it by retrieving the missing piece or severing the connection. He wasn't sure which, but he had no intention of doing either. Hopefully, this injury wouldn't affect him too much when creating more clones, especially since that was exactly what he was planning to do right now. It was early in the morning, although Percy's room was currently pitch black, as he had closed the curtains. The last thing he needed was somebody seeing what he intended to do today. Mickey, start hunting. Caw! The familiar was roaming the base of the fungal spire, searching for starry drones to munch on. He could already kill a couple starry workers by himself, but it took too long, and it was dangerous to let him hunt on the second floor by himself. Percy would have to settle for the less potent soul mana they could gather from the red bugs. Still, between the crow's help and the increased regeneration brought about by the colorful motes, he estimated he would have a much easier time forming his new clone. Pressing down his bubbling enthusiasm, he began by sending pulses of soul mana through his channels, letting them bounce off his soul's edge. Not wanting to interfere with his connection to Mickey, he had adjusted the angle slightly, so that the mana would gather a few inches below the previous spot after being reflected. By the time that happened, he was ready to grab a hold of the bulge, pulling it out of his skin. Damn, I sure didn't miss the pain. He winced as the strain caused some tears to form. However, he quickly raised an eyebrow after examining them for a couple of seconds. Is it me? Or is the damage less extensive than last time? This was strange. If anything, he would have expected his injury to have negatively impacted the integrity of his soul, making it more fragile than before. That didn't seem to be the case. It was hard to say for sure, but the cracks appeared both less numerous and less serious than the last time he'd done this. Has my soul grown stronger in the past year? Why would that be the case? He'd spent all this time recovering. Then again, wasn't that how muscles and bones worked? Exercising essentially involved damaging and repairing one's body repeatedly. Perhaps the same principle applied to his soul. Then, maybe I can strengthen my soul enough to use circulation with my first core if I keep sending clones. This was an issue that had troubled him for a long time. Although the technique he'd learned on Huehue had served him well until now, he greatly lamented only being able to use it with his second core. After all, it was much weaker than the one in his sternum, both in grade and affinity. Evidently, the solution had been right under his nose all along. In his excitement, the young man nearly let go of the bulge. Shit. Focus, Percy. It was a project for the future. While it was a nice surprise, it wasn't worth ruining his current attempt. Shaking the distracting thoughts out of his head, he sent another pulse through his soul, which soon caused the bulge to grow. More soul mana began flowing into his core a few minutes later too, as Mickey had already taken down the first drone. Keep it up, buddy. 8 hours later, Percy was holding an outstretched chunk of his soul larger than an apple. Thanks to his familiar's diligent efforts, he had reached this step 4 hours sooner than the last time. I can keep going, but it's best not to risk it. This was already the same amount he'd used for his previous clone, so he knew it was enough to survive for a couple days. Perhaps he could increase that if he gathered more of the silver flame before cutting it off, but he didn't want to damage his soul more than he could handle. Moving to the next phase then. Pulling the mana out of his core, he directed it all straight into the bulge, filling it up like a water skin. Taking deep breaths, he strove to gather even more, as his familiar intensified his efforts to support him. Let's give the clone more mana than last time. Back then, Percy had done this out on a limb, without knowing if it would help in any way. Still, that had obviously been the correct decision. His clone had greatly relied on the stashed mana multiple times during his adventure, whether to bond with Mickey's soul initially or to deliver the killing blow to Mixcoatl near the end. Suffice to say, the young man didn't mind investing a few more hours to overcharge his clone again. It wasn't until another 4 hours later that Percy stopped. Right now, the bulge had bloated up by about 50% of its previous volume. It still contained the same amount of his soul as before, but its surface stretched due to the dense quantity of mana sealed within. The young man briefly considered pushing some more into it, but at this rate he might cause the clone to burst before he even sent it out. Plus, the mana was already slowly leaking, as his willpower was scarcely sufficient to keep it contained. It actually resembles Baldi's clones somewhat. Unlike his previous attempt, the soul mana was so concentrated it was fully visible even to the naked eye, appearing like a silver bubble pulsing akin to a beating heart. This reassured Percy somewhat. All this time he'd been fumbling in the dark with his bloodline, mostly doing whatever he instinctively felt made sense. Still, the more his efforts looked like what his family did with their version, the more confidence he had that he was on the right track. Okay then. Now for the really painful part. After refilling his core one last time, he tossed another glance at his handiwork, nodding in appreciation. Then he stirred his bloodline, feeling the ghostly claw forming in his sternum. Please go where I want you to go. If it insisted on heading to the previous spot, it could harm his connection to the familiar. Percy focused all his willpower to direct it slightly lower, towards the thrumming bubble he had spent all day cultivating. Luckily, the ghostly claw didn't need much prodding either, as it gladly acquiesced, pouncing on the bulge like a cat would a mouse. Percy gritted his teeth in agony as all the tears in his soul widened. He held his breath, watching the ghostly claw clamp the soul and mana alike, twisting them and pulling them out of his body. And with an audible popping sound, accompanied by a violent shockwave rippling through his very existence, Percy felt his world tremble as the silver bubble was ripped out of his stomach, shooting off like a meteor. By the time his head sank into the pillow, his eyes had already closed shut. Ah! Caw! Caw! Percy's eyes bolted open, a splitting headache making him dizzy. Damn, I'm alive, was his first thought. Wait, no. That was supposed to be a good thing. CW, the familiar called to him again. Percy could practically taste the palpable sense of panic oozing through their bond. The realization simultaneously gave him a fuzzy feeling at having somebody who cared, but also a pang of guilt in his chest. It's okay, buddy.
I'm okay.
I'm sorry I worried you. Getting off his bed was tough, but it was promising he was even capable of standing. Pulling the curtain open, he noted it was dark outside. How long was I out? He knew it shouldn't have been more than a day or two, otherwise he would have starved. Well, he was feeling a little peckish, but not quite starving yet. Caw! Mickey sent him an image of a single sunset, though no sunrise. It was still the same day. This was good. He couldn't afford to knock himself out for a week every time he sent out a new clone. Walking was a hassle, but he made his way to the door. He sure hoped Freddy was open, as he was too tired to cook, and he could use a honey roll right about now. Suddenly, he lost his balance. Falling to his knees, his consciousness sucked right out of his body. One moment he was still in his room. The next he felt the wind press against him, colorful motes whizzing by from all directions. He was diving towards a bug, its carapace pitch black, with bright spots glistening all over the sleek chitin. A drone? I'm Mickey. They felt dizzy, banking towards the left. Flapping their wings at the last second, they barely managed to soften their landing, narrowly avoiding a nasty crash on the ground. What the hell? He thought, as he returned to his own body, lying against the cold stone of his room's floor. More came gushing through the cord. Images, feelings, memories, thoughts. He felt his familiar's confusion, as his mind drifted back and forth between the bodies a couple more times. Are you doing this? He asked the bird once the situation seemed to stabilize. Caw. The reply was strained. Mickey didn't seem to understand much more than he did. What was going on? Chapter 48, Limit. What? Percy asked. Freddy gave him a concerned look. I said, are you sure you're okay? He repeated. The young man felt his mind slipping again, but he resisted the pull. Yeah, sorry. It's been a long day. He forced himself to say. It was only now he remembered he was holding a honey roll. Thank Phoebe I haven't dropped it. Not that he was in the mood to eat, but it would have looked strange. He searched his pocket for some change, but his friend stopped him. It's on the house today. Just look after yourself, man. You're the only one I see who's hunting 18 hours a day. No breaks. Clearly, it's not sustainable. Percy nodded, thanking Freddy before leaving in a hurry. Going out in this state hadn't been his brightest idea. It wasn't until he got back home that he allowed himself to fall on the bed, leaving the snack on a table for later. Soon, another episode hit him, but he allowed himself to sink into Mickey's body this time. They were pecking the core out of the drone when he joined him. Percy had watched the bird hunt, as Mickey had inadvertently sent him the images. He'd nearly got stung too, having lost his concentration during what would have otherwise been a trivial kill. As the soul got digested in the familiar stomach, Percy's mind followed the soul mana back to his own body. He quickly forced it to his eyes to see what the hell was going on with him. Nothing too weird there, he frowned. His soul didn't look much different from the time he went to Huehue. There was the small scar near his sternum, a grapefruit-sized crater above his stomach, and a bunch of cracks all over. Fewer than before too, due to his increased resilience. It's not due to excessive damage. This was different than even the time he'd woken up after creating the familiar. Rather than pain or weakness, it felt more like his sense of self was shaken, as if he had trouble remaining himself. Is it because I have two connections at the same time? This didn't bode well for his ambitious plan of forming an army of familiars. At this rate, he'd be lucky if he could keep sending out clones. Hopefully, the clone isn't affected. And there it was, the good old infinite nothingness he fondly remembered. Unlike the last clone, this one accepted his identity promptly, beginning the search for a body without delay. He knew this was one of the most critical parts of the journey. During his previous attempt, 3 weeks had passed on Remier, but he shouldn't have spent longer than a couple of days on Huehue. This could only mean one of two things. Either there was a huge mismatch in the flow of time from one world to another, or he had spent most of it in the space between them. Consequently, the faster he moved here the better. Retracing his actions, he allowed his senses to expand outwards, touching upon the sea of souls. Brushing over them without focusing too intently was a little tricky at first. Percy had grown rusty, having not done this in over a year, but he soon got a grip on it. Too powerful, too weak, too powerful again, too broken, too weak. He couldn't tell how long it took, but he eventually picked one he liked, reaching towards it without missing a beat. A moment later, he found himself lodged between the nooks and crannies of the dying soul. It was more cramped than last time, but that was a good thing. It meant his new host was in a better condition than Mickey had been in, and, having learned from his past experience, he was a lot more careful moving around, trying not to exert much pressure on the fragments before the new guy accepted him. "Hello? Anybody home?" No reply. Nothing verbal, at least. A sense of panic and pain assaulted him. Also hunger and cold, indescribable cold. Percy's very soul shivered. Did this person freeze to death? His host felt distant. They didn't seem aggressive. At least, they didn't push him away yet. But they cowered in a corner, trying to avoid being touched. "I'm not here to hurt you. Can you talk?" The creature didn't understand him. Its intelligence seemed even more rudimentary than his familiars had been right after hatching. A beast, perhaps? That put Percy at a bit of an impasse. He couldn't begin the process of patching up their souls into something workable unless his host opened up. But they couldn't even communicate properly. The only clues he had were that it was afraid, in pain, starving, and really cold. "Well, I don't know how to deal with the fear or the pain. I could send it the taste of a honey roll, but I don't even know what this thing eats." There was only one thing he could do. He dug through his memories for anything suitable. The first one he found was a time he was nestled in a blanket, enjoying some hot soup during the winter. He couldn't even tell how old he was, maybe 4 or 5. It was after his folks died, and the blanket was cozy, almost reminding him of his mother's hug. A weird thing to replace one's parents with, he knew, but he was willing to cut himself some slack. It wasn't like toddler Percy had anybody else in his life back then. He hadn't grown close to Elaine until later. "Does this work for you, pal? I'll help you find warmth like that too if you let me in." Suspicion. Percy counted it as progress. You'd only get suspicious about something you hoped was true. Well, not that it was true, of course. It was an empty promise. He had no idea if he could deliver. He'd try to make good on it if possible, but he wasn't going to cry if he ended up lying to the animal either. Better keep this last part to myself. At least, he was more in control of what he allowed to leak through the connection this time. The bond was more intrusive when he possessed something than it was with his familiar, but he'd still gained enough experience over the past year to filter his thoughts somewhat. A few more carefully picked memories and some placating later, the creature opened up enough to let him move around without harming it. The hard part is over. His soul wisp expanded and twisted, stretching through the gaps and touching as many of the broken shards as possible. Only then did he unleash his sizable stash of soul mana, letting it do its thing. Like glue, the potent substance forged a bridge between the two entities, as they came closer together than ever before. Memories flashed through Percy's mind, one after another, hatching through an egg, a nest full of tiny gecko-like things, cannibalism, running away, hiding from giant shadows, scavenging for scraps, cold, shivering, freezing cold. Oh, and they were all monochrome. Great, because who needs colors? Percy tried opening his new eyes. They refused to budge. He wasn't sure if he was signaling the wrong muscles or if the problem lied elsewhere. "Any help? Can you open our eyes?" Silence. The beast was still in there somewhere, but it refused to come to the surface, happy to observe from the background. "Okay, fine. Thanks for the body, I guess." Unable to figure out how to control this thing, he fell back to his status instead. Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana Core 1. Orange. Beast. Mana Core 2. Seed. Ew. Spells. Parting Gift, Crude. Ew. Grants access to your status. Incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. Percy would have frowned if he could. Nothing special there. His clone didn't have a proper name this time, which frankly made sense. An orange core was decent. Not too high, but it could have been worse. Only his parting gift was listed under spells, because it was the only one he could currently use. The Beast Affinity and the incomplete second mana core were also expected. So, what do we do with you? There wasn't a question mark thingy to bring back to Remir, and he didn't think the lizard knew any profound techniques to teach. He also doubted it would make a good familiar, nor had he any intention of crippling himself again to try. Yeah, this one is definitely a lost cause. He'd thought the exact same thing on Huehue, only to be proven wrong. Still, he was willing to bet good money it was true this time. He could walk around, hoping to find something interesting, but he hadn't a clue how to even bring it back. Were there even any sentient races on this world? Maybe I can try finding a life source and learn what happens when a beast gets a second core. That sounded like a plan. It would be a good data point so he'd know what to expect from Mickey. Not the most rewarding venture, but probably the best he could get out of the creature. Assuming this body is even capable of moving, that is, it didn't respond to any commands. He couldn't even hear his own heartbeat. Frustrated, he grew less gentle with it. His owner didn't seem to care, so why should he? He willed any muscle to move. He tried to give himself a panic attack. Anything. A twitch. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of feedback. Capitalizing on it, he redoubled his efforts, trying to expand on the sensation. Something cracked. More twitches followed. A muscle group. He could feel a limb unfold slowly. A foreleg, if he understood the lizard's physiology correctly. The cracking sounds intensified. Every time a joint moved, something broke. Are we frozen solid? It would certainly explain his host's aversion to cold and their impairment. Why didn't it hurt, though? Were they numb? A couple frantic spasms later, Percy received his answer. He didn't get the chance to celebrate his newly freed limb before it began burning, as if on fire. Damn! That didn't make him give up, though. If anything, it was proof his efforts were paying off. He figured the pain would stop either when he froze completely again, or when he fully thawed, and the latter seemed preferable. He ignored the other limbs, focusing inwards. The sooner he jump-started their heart, the faster his torture would come to an end. Assuming we even have one at the usual spot. Fortunately, they did, as he found out a couple minutes later. Its beats were soft and infrequent. He thought there was something wrong with the organ, or that it would take a while to get back to normal. But it never did. At some point, he was forced to accept that this was normal for the lizard. In any case, the pain had receded slightly. Even more importantly, he realized, to his great joy, he could finally open their eyes. A flash of white greeted him, which soon died down to an everything else of white. Chapter 49, Frozen Expanse. Snow covered the ground below like a white blanket. Percy was standing on a steeply inclined surface, a boulder or something. This world must have harsh winters. Not used to looking at everything sideways, he climbed down from the rock. He noticed his host didn't weigh much, their feet not sinking very deep, their steps barely leaving some shallow prints. Good. Let's not attract any predators so soon. Examining his surroundings, he realized his host wasn't the only unlucky lizard. Countless more geckos stood motionless all around him, having met the same fate. Either some extinction-level event had occurred in this region, or it was normal for his species to go through cycles of freezing and thawing with the seasons. Oh well, you don't mind me eating their cores, do you? He asked his new pal. Percy had already experienced some of the lizard's memories. He'd watched his host devour its own siblings, so he doubted it cared. That said, he figured it was polite to ask. No reply. Shrugging, he activated Mana Sense, noting most of the creatures were not only still alive, but also at orange like him. Approaching the nearest one, he dug its core out with his claws, before swallowing it whole. It didn't even taste that bad. Normally, Percy wasn't a huge fan of raw meat, especially when frozen solid. That said, his new taste buds appeared to have a thing for blood-flavored snow. Another pleasant surprise soon followed. A burst of mana was released in their stomach, warming them up. This was finally enough to elicit a satisfied reaction from his host. Although, the timid lizard quickly faded to the background again, happy to let Percy do all the work. It's that passive attitude that screwed you up in the first place. Percy reprimanded the gecko, before moving to the next statue. He had no idea how close the lizard was to advancing, but it wouldn't take that long to eat all the cores. It was a bit of a gamble, but if he got lucky, he'd have a much easier time traveling at Yellow. As he continued slaughtering one gecko after the other, a strange thought crossed his mind. The lizards looked rather similar to what one could find on Remier, making him wonder whether he'd even left his world. A quick glance at the sky gave him his answer. Never mind. Definitely a coincidence. There was only one sun, its color unknown, but that was where the similarities ended. Percy counted as many as 17 moons of various sizes, and guessed there should be more that weren't visible right now. And those were just the semi-intact ones. Many more broken, irregular chunks of stone littered the sky, making it look like a cosmic cesspit. I wonder what the story is there. Did they just collide against each other? Or did somebody do this? The mere thought sent shivers down Percy's reptilian spine. He had no idea if a god was even capable of such a feat, and he'd rather not find out. He wasn't keen on meeting a being capable of tossing moons around like pebbles. After all, what else would such an existence be capable of? Detecting souls, maybe? Eager to get the hell out of this world, he picked up the pace, guzzling down one core after another, uncaring about the lizard genocide he was committing. Of course, he still had to take frequent breaks to digest the mana every time his body reached saturation. While he couldn't devour the gecko's souls like Mickey, the beast mana contained in their cores still accumulated rapidly after eating so many in quick succession. This is the most boring clone I've ever made, he thought as he sat on the snow waiting once more. It had been several hours since he managed to thaw his host, and he'd already consumed hundreds of cores in that time. The sun had set too, but luckily his eyes turned out less useless than expected, as they appeared to possess some level of night vision. Percy's core was still at orange, although more than 2/3 of the lizards remained. At his current rate, it would take him another day to finish the rest. Hopefully it won't be a waste of time. His fear wasn't the only thing rushing him. Given the relatively good condition of his body coupled with the ungodly amount of soul mana he had used to patch it up, he was confident he could easily survive for a week or two. Let's not dilly-dally then. Standing up, he walked to the next lizard, about to resume his feast. Not that he had much of an appetite left. While the first dozen or so had tasted all right, he'd grown sick after spending the whole afternoon stuffing his face full of them. Also, the statues looked much creepier at night. Either way, he never got the chance to take another bite, as he saw movement off the corner of his eye. What the hell is that? He thought, as a wave of primal terror overcame his host. A massive shape was slithering some distance away, its pale color barely discernible against the frozen expanse. Much like the geckos, the serpent also vaguely reminded Percy of something he might encounter on Remier, but it was his first time seeing a snake covered in fur. Shit, it's set green. He had no idea how large his host was compared to a human, but the abomination appeared colossal to his current eyes, its girth 4 times his own. As for its length, it was impossible to estimate as it zigged and zagged through the army of statues, swallowing them whole one after the other. What do I do? Percy briefly considered playing dead. A moment later he realized how idiotic the idea was. Even if the snake somehow missed the trail of footprints behind him, the thick stench of blood coming from him or his elevated body temperature, It certainly couldn't miss the sea of mana coursing through his channels. But more importantly, the serpent clearly wouldn't stop until it devoured every last one of his kin. Whether he stood still or not, his end would be the same. Oh well. Worst case scenario, it eats me. Out of options and without much to lose, Percy waited for the snake to look the other way before sprinting as if his life depended on it, which it did. He didn't even dare to look back, only using mana sense half a minute later to check if the monster was in hot pursuit. It wasn't. Only then did he stop, turning around. The snake was still busy eating the other geckos a few hundred meters away. What? Am I not tasty enough for you, you bastard? Percy wasn't sure whether to be relieved or offended. He was certain the creature had noticed him, but it hadn't bothered giving chase. Then again, it wasn't that surprising. Why waste time going after the lone survivor when it had a veritable feast laid out in front of it? I doubt it would be willing to share, though. Perhaps the serpent didn't care much about a single gecko slipping away, but it was probably not going to take too kindly to him returning. Great! All those hours wasted. Frustrated, Percy entertained the thought of going back to confront the snake. He knew he was no match for a yellow beast, let alone a green one, so he'd definitely die. That said, ending this farce a moment sooner might be his best course of action right now. But he shook his head. He realized he'd been spoiled by his past clone successes. His current situation was likely more indicative of what he should expect going forward. The odds of stumbling upon a treasure trove every time weren't high, so giving up after the first setback would be unwise. Let's wander around for another day or two. If I can't find anything interesting, I'll leave. As for what something interesting might be, he wasn't sure. He guessed he'd know when he found it. Perhaps a potent life source for his second core. Another cluster of frozen lizards he could eat, a village of sentient life forms, or any other rare treasure might qualify. Just as Percy made up his mind, a loud screech caused him to tilt his head up. The only thing he managed to see was a shadow blotting out the sky. He didn't even get the chance to examine it with mana sense, before an elongated maw snapped shut around his head. At least it didn't hurt, the pain not yet registering, as his face rolled inside something slimy, before plunging into a pungent swamp. And with that, his vision faded to black, an irresistible force prying him out of the gecko's flesh, bringing his third adventure to an abrupt end. Worst clone ever. Chapter 50. The hunt resumes. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Percy was running along a bridge, circulation active, with a wasp corpse the size of a fox slung over his shoulder. The stinger pointed forward, ensuring he wouldn't accidentally stab himself. Caw! The crow was flying at half its usual speed with another worker hot on its trail. 10 minutes later, they met up. Percy tossed the carapace in front of his familiar, before gathering both types of mana in his right hand, forming a cyan glove and a transparent sickle. He dashed towards the bird, who circled around him. Mickey dug into the corpse's sternum for its snack, as Percy engaged his pursuer. The fight was short. Percy dodged the first few stabs before a well-executed parry with his backhand doubled as a lethal counterattack, swiping the parting gift across the bug's torso. As soon as the second wasp died, he ignored it, letting Mickey deal with the corpse once he finished his current meal. Instead, Percy moved toward the third target, conveniently located on the same mushroom. A minute later, it met the same fate. Just in time, too, as Mickey arrived at Percy's location, gently holding 2 glands in his talons. How far to the next batch? Percy asked while squeezing the nectar into a vial. Caw! Caw! The bird showed him the locations of 3 more workers, the nearest over half an hour away, eliciting a groan from the young man. Ok. I'll go there. You bait that one. We'll meet up here, he said, getting a nod back. Their current hunting strategy was a lot different from what Percy had originally envisioned. Based on what others had told him soon after he joined the guild, he'd thought he and Mickey should ideally grow proficient enough to split up and hunt separately. After all, they could cover more ground like that on paper. And indeed, both of them had improved a lot after a month, to the point Mickey could even kill a few wasps on his own by now. However, their strengths and weaknesses had developed rather disproportionately to one another. On one hand, Percy was quite adept at killing the bugs with his glove and sickle, often dispatching them within seconds. As much as his familiar had improved in this department, he doubted it would get as good as him anytime soon. On the other hand, Percy was held up by his slower traveling speed. Even if he knew where the bugs were, he still needed several minutes to reach each one, let alone when he had to blindly search for them. Yet scouting was precisely where Mickey excelled. Consequently, he had concluded that the most efficient strategy should make use of both their talents, while covering their shortcomings. Mickey would locate the bugs and bait the more distant ones over, while Percy was in charge of putting them down. Like that, they had reached an average of 29 daily kills by the end of the month. Still not enough, though. Percy smiled bitterly as he crossed the bridge. Strictly speaking, he could now earn over 400 contribution points per hunt, which was just barely enough to cover for one of his cores. However, that was under the assumption that he'd hunt every single day without fail. Unfortunately, some downtime was unavoidable. His third clone had needed 3 full days for the round trip, forcing Percy to remain idle in that time. At first, he had intended to keep hunting while his clone was away. Due to his soul's injuries, he knew it would be harder to accumulate soul mana by himself, but he could still form the sickle with Mickey's help. Sadly, he couldn't have accounted for the unexpected issue with his soul's integrity, caused by having 2 ethereal cords simultaneously. Hunting in that state was ill-advised, as a single moment of weakness could cost them dearly. I guess we just need to raise the bar a bit more to cover for the idle days. There was a little room for improvement, but not a lot. Percy estimated they'd cap out at 32 kills after some more experience, but that was it. He couldn't get much quicker at killing the bugs, and neither could Mickey fly any faster. The only thing he could help was getting circulation to work for the rest of the afternoon. I wanted to siphon the excess profits into alchemy, not to cover for my clone's adventures. He smiled bitterly. Of course, he could just stop creating clones. He shook his head. As annoyed as he was when his first clone in over a year came back empty-handed, Percy had no intention of giving up on his ability entirely. He'd always known this would happen. Not every dying body in the universe held some profound magical secret, but he'd never find the few diamonds in the rough if he stopped looking altogether. Perhaps somebody else in his shoes might have grown content with a second core and a familiar, but Percy understood his current kit wasn't sufficient to reach the pinnacle. Sending clones is the one thing I can't compromise on, even if it slows down my advancement. Percy entered the settlement after another exhausting hunt. In the end, they'd only harvested 29 glands again, the same as yesterday and the day before. His efficiency had only dropped slightly a couple hours before sunset, when circulation failed him. Still, it was hard to extend its duration any further, and he couldn't figure out a better way to use his mana than his current glove-sickle combo. It didn't help that he woke up tired every morning, as 5 hours of sleep didn't seem to cut it. Maybe I should look into recovery potions. They weren't very good, but he only needed the tiniest boost. It would all depend on their price, though. He was about to head to one of the official buildings to exchange his nectar, when his gaze landed on the drowsy girl's stand. Ha! She's still growing. He chuckled. Contrary to his expectations, her information trade had not only survived over the past month, but even boomed somewhat. Percy had been shocked to see her jar steadily filling over time, until she had amassed enough money to expand her business. Her sign now read, "Buying and selling information on the 3rd and 4th level ES." Much to Percy's annoyance, she hadn't even bothered to nail a new plank with the changes, instead sticking a couple pieces of paper to patch in the new words. Yet, the 5 jars on the counter, all filled with red and orange coins, were proof enough that she knew what she was doing. Maybe I should try something like this too. Percy's eyelid twitched as he listened to the girl snoring without a care in the world. At the beginning he'd felt happy for her, but it was starting to irritate him. She was making nearly as many points as he was, while sitting around all day. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if she surpassed him before long. But he sighed a moment later, realizing it wouldn't work for him. Forget it. I have no idea how to broker information. There's clearly some secret behind her success. Otherwise, everyone would be doing it. Ignoring her, he walked to Freddy's for his daily honey roll. Eating the delicious snacks after each hunt had grown into a bit of a ritual by now. Also, Freddy was currently his only friend in the guild, and it was nice having somebody to talk to. Only 10 minutes later did Percy leave, trying to catch the official buildings before they closed for the night. I wish I didn't have to go through so many hoops though. The most annoying part was that he had to visit 2 different shops, in opposite corners of the settlement. He only sold half his loot at each location, and alternated which one he bought his elixirs from, to avoid unnecessary questions. He knew he was probably just being paranoid, as nobody had ever asked him where he got his nectar. Even if somebody figured out that an orange core was somehow making over 400 points per day, they wouldn't care too much. Still, he did prefer to take any precautions he could. Anything else I can help you with? The clerk at the second shop, a brunette clad in green, asked after handing him a vial of elixir. Percy was about to shake his head absent-mindedly when he thought of something. Since I'm here, I might as well. Do you sell potions? Chapter 51 Potions. Of course, the clerk replied before scratching her head. Although, I'm forced by guild regulations to inform potential customers that the potion's potency is rather limited. So I've been told. But how limited are we talking about exactly? Well, they work as advertised, but don't expect any miracles on par with the elixirs, she elaborated, before furrowing her brow. Although I suppose they'll be somewhat effective for you. No offense. Percy nodded. None taken. I'd like to have a look if it's not too difficult. The clerk shrugged, before leading him to an adjacent room. She pressed her badge against a symbol on the wall, causing a different rune to light up on the ceiling, illuminating the place. It wasn't a large room and, if the dust on the shelves was any indication, it was rarely used. I guess nobody cares enough to inscribe self-cleaning runes in the potion room. As you can imagine, not many of our alchemists bother brewing potions, and even fewer customers ever buy them. Still, we currently have 4 different varieties of sufficient quality to be approved for sale by the guild. Seeing Percy remain silent, she continued. The most popular ones, relatively speaking, are the healing potions. They can help mend injuries for people below yellow. Just minor stuff though. No raising the dead or regrowing limbs. It might be worth having 1 or 2 of these on me, for an emergency. So far, Percy had survived his first month on the spire without getting stabbed by the wasps, so he doubted he'd get in much trouble anytime soon. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have something to fall back to in case of an accident. How much? The clerk smiled. Just 10 points per dose. If we went solely by the price of the ingredients and the expertise required to brew them, they'd be a lot more expensive. However, the supply far exceeds their demand. Our senior alchemists only bother with them whenever they want a break from elixirs. The same is true for the other potions. Lucky me. I'll take 3 of these then, Percy said. He didn't have much money to splurge on them, but if it was a one-time thing he could afford it. He doubted he'd need them replaced anytime soon. The clerk handed him 3 glass vials. Apparently, the gemstones were too precious to be used for cheap potions. Percy could see a glowing green liquid swirling inside. Probably some life mana somehow processed into this form. In any case, this wasn't what he was here for. Tossing the potions into his pockets, he paid the clerk 3 orange coins, before asking her about the rest. Next we have magic potions. She gestured to a row of vials, their contents shimmering in a light blue color. Their main ingredient is a flower with pure mana properties, and they can refill your core once consumed. However, they only contain enough for an orange core, and the conversion rate to other affinities is abysmal. Percy made an odd expression. On paper, it sounded like these potions were tailor-made for him. He had a red core with a pure affinity, which meant there was nobody else on Remir who could benefit more from these potions than him. A single dose could refill his core thrice over. Still, circulation boosted his mana regeneration the most, so he couldn't recall ever getting in a situation that couldn't be resolved through his refined spell. In the end, he shook his head, prompting the clerk to continue. These are called enlightenment potions. Please pardon us for the tacky name. It is a bit on the nose considering their subpar effect, but they do help you focus for a couple hours after consuming them. They are best used before studying, she said, pointing to a shelf of bright red potions that looked a bit like glowing blood. Percy's eyes widened. They might be handy for him if he decided to read up on alchemy, but that wasn't what surprised him. Do they contain mind mana by any chance? He asked, trying to mask his inner turmoil. He probably did a poor job at it, as the clerk chuckled upon seeing his expression. Yeah, I'm sure you see the pattern by now. Our alchemists have drawn inspiration from elixirs, trying to brew other affinities into potions, although their results leave much to be desired. None of them exceed what an orange core is capable of. Percy quickly ran some calculations in his head. Baldy had needed around 1,800 refills to germinate his second core. If these enlightenment potions contained as much mana as an orange core, he'd need somewhere around 110,000 doses for Mickey. He smiled wryly at that conclusion. That's over 1 million contribution points. Do they even have that many in stock? Even if he somehow managed to amass the outlandish sum, he'd have to find a way to buy the potions without arousing suspicion. Still, this was his first lead, so it was something to keep in mind for the future. Do you want to buy some? The clerk asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Not right now. Mickey aside, he definitely wanted to hit the library in the next couple of days. Perhaps the enlightenment potions would be handy at that time, but they weren't a priority at the moment. Shrugging, the clerk moved to the final shelf filled with brown potions. This time, she had to brush some cobwebs aside, speaking volumes as to the last time anybody bought any of these. This is the final item, and the least popular, I'm afraid. They are called rejuvenation potions, and you're meant to drink them before going to bed. Supposedly, they help you rest more overnight, but the difference isn't huge, and it's not like sleep deprivation is a serious issue in the guild. You don't seem very keen on promoting your merchandise, Percy noted. The clerk hadn't really painted any of the potions in a positive light since he got here. It was his first time experiencing something like this in a shop. She chuckled. Well, it's not like I get a commission based on sales. Besides, all the prices in this shop are fixed according to guild rules. Also, the profits from the potions are peanuts compared to the elixirs, and the demand for those is set in stone, regardless of my conduct. Thank Phoebe for it too. People only volunteer for these posts to relax. Nobody would bother if it was a hassle. So yeah, I might as well be honest with the customers. This arrangement suited Percy just fine. So what mana do these contain? He asked. Don't quote me on this, but I believe it's a mixture of life and mind mana. However, they are designed to have a more delayed effect compared to the other potions. They basically work by augmenting your body's natural recovery over a longer period of time. So don't try relying on them in a pinch, but they'll probably give you more value for your points overnight. Okay, I'll take one of these for now, Percy said. Truth be told, none of the potions seemed revolutionary, but the brown ones sounded like the most suitable to his situation. He'd try one tonight to see if it helped. A single dose was worth less points than a starry worker, so if it let him get an extra kill tomorrow, it would pay for itself. He left after thanking the clerk. Returning home was a pain in the ass, as the shop was in the other side of the settlement. Shit, I have to wake up in 5 hours, and I still haven't taken today's elixirs. He grimaced. Picking up the pace, he made it to his house in a rush, only lamenting the fact that he couldn't activate circulation in the middle of the guild. Not many people were out and about this late, but it wasn't worth the risk just to sleep a few minutes longer. As soon as he entered his room, he downed the expensive elixir before getting into the shower. To save time, he circulated his pure mana between his stomach and abdomen while the warm water splashed on his shoulders, washing the grime off him. The mana burned wherever it passed, as he had overused his channels again. On top of that, his body soreness made it a struggle to even stand, but he gritted his teeth to see this through. Half an hour later, he was in his bed, drinking a dose of the diluted elixir. Mickey, can you eat the bug now? For the next couple of weeks, Percy would need some help generating enough soul mana for the elixirs. They'd arranged for Mickey to keep a half-dead starry drone by his side, with its stinger broken and its wings clipped, to be eaten on demand. Caw! The familiar appeared half asleep, but a modest trickle of mana still flowed through the connection a few moments later. Percy took deep breaths to reinforce it, as he circulated it between his stomach and sternum. By the time he finished, there were less than 4 hours left before sunrise. Picking up the rejuvenation potion, he gave it a swirl, gazing at the brown liquid as if it was the most precious treasure. He uncorked the vial with his mouth, carelessly spitting the lid on the floor before gulping the potion down. It wasn't bitter like the elixirs. It was sweet, reminding him of thin syrup. I really hope it does something, or tomorrow is going to suck so much. Chapter 52, Time Management. Percy woke up feeling all right. He stretched out on his bed, before glancing around the dimly lit room. Just enough sunlight seeped through the curtain to cast soft shadows on the walls. Percy wasn't exactly fully rested, and he'd gladly sleep for another hour if it were an option. As the shopkeeper had said, the effect of the rejuvenation potion was rather modest. Still impressive, though. All things considered, Percy had barely slept 4 hours, yet he was less tired than the previous mornings. His soreness remained, but it was muted. Pulling some mana from his abdomen also revealed that his channels had somewhat recovered. At least they didn't burn as much. Percy was tempted to keep buying the brown potions if only to improve his quality of life. Not feeling like crap had to count for something. No, let's make sure it gets me some tangible results first. He decided, getting up. Tossing his robe on, he opened his house's preservation box, taking a bottle of milk out. Next, he hurriedly drank 2 mouthfuls before rushing out of his house with a loaf of bread held by his teeth, eager to begin hunting. If he managed 30 kills today, he'd absolutely use that as an excuse to justify buying the potions. Half an hour later, Mickey tilted his head upon seeing him, clearly noticing he was in a good mood. Caw? Percy chuckled, feeling a rare lightness in his steps. Even the colorful motes slowly falling on the mushroom looked prettier than usual. It's a secret. He smirked, acting all mysterious. Caw, caw. The familiar pecked him a few times. Ouch. Damn. Okay. It's a thing that made me sleep better. Percy broke rather easily, rubbing his arm. That only seemed to pour oil in the fire, however. Caw. Kreia. Caw. Percy shielded his face with his elbows, curling on the ground to cover as much of his body as possible. Why are you even complaining? I'm the one who has circulation active all day. Caw. Mickey sent him the memory of being woken up in the middle of the night. Fine. If they prove useful, I'll consider buying you some too. Only then did the bird stop torturing him, a satisfied glint in its eye. You extortionist. Have you at least found any wasps on the way here? He exhaled in defeat. Mickey remained silent, only sending him a few images of starry workers on some nearby mushrooms. Nodding, Percy took a deep breath, and then another. Next, he sprinted towards their first target for the day as the cyan lines shone under his skin. Caw! Caw! Mickey reminded him of his promise as he crossed the final bridge connecting the second level to the spire's base. All right, a deal's a deal. I'll bring you one tomorrow. The young man replied. His steps were uneven, as were his breaths. However, a shit-eating grin was plastered all over his face, despite the exhaustion. Today, they had managed to harvest 31 glands, proving the efficacy of the rejuvenation potion. Well, okay. Perhaps part of it was just luck, another part a placebo. Still, Percy was quite certain his recent purchase had contributed to some extent. After all, once the mana began burning his channels and circulation started feeling heavier, he was able to push through, keeping the technique active until the end. He doubted he had achieved this through sheer willpower. Overall, he was satisfied, not only with the potion but also his improvements since joining the guild. He and Mickey had started with a laughable 14 kills on their first day, yet they had more than doubled that number since. His only regret was that there didn't seem to be any room for further improvement. At least not on the second floor. And he wasn't confident in risking their lives or their secrets on the third one. This meant he had to make do with 465 contribution points per hunt for the foreseeable future, assuming he could keep this up. It's enough for one core, even if I account for 3 days of downtime per month. Of course, it was possible one of his clones might need longer, but in that case, he'd just have to accept the loss and hope he got something worthwhile in return. More importantly, this would also leave him enough change for 2 potions per day. One of those had to be his daily dose of the rejuvenation potion. It was already indispensable in his mind. The second slot placed him in a bit of a dilemma though. On one hand, he wanted to get brown potions for Mickey, to compensate the crow for helping him recover soul mana. He needed his help both to use the diluted elixirs with his first core, but also to begin clearing the corresponding set of channels. On the other, he had to start reading up on alchemy. Saving 1,000 points for each lecture was out of the question, so his only option was to hit the library and hope the enlightenment potions helped. And there was another problem. Why can't there be more than 24 hours in a day? Percy felt like tearing his hair out. His hunting trips already lasted 18 hours, of which one was spent just traveling to and from the mushrooms. He couldn't cut the time down, else his income would also drop. Of the remaining 6 hours, 1 was spent at home drinking elixirs. His other activities, such as socializing with Freddy or exchanging his points, only ate into his sleep. Suffice to say, he couldn't reduce that any further either. The only way is to learn how to use the elixirs while walking. It might take some practice, but it would save him an hour per day. He could spend that either in the library or at home unblocking his channels. Let's alternate between the two. I'll do the same with the potions. Having settled on a plan, Percy entered the settlement, stopping by Freddy's for a few minutes. Next, he went to the official shops, this time buying his elixir from the other one. He also got 2 doses of the rejuvenation potion, 1 for himself and 1 to hand to his familiar tomorrow. Only then did he head home, taking a shower and downing one of the new potions before going to bed. He didn't drink any elixirs today, as he had to adjust the time he took them. Percy got up, feeling even better than yesterday. Evidently, an extra hour of sleep got him even more value out of the potion. After dressing and eating a tomato, no time for a salad, he ran out of his house, taking 2 doses of elixir with him, a regular and a diluted one. However, he didn't drink them just yet. His plan was to take the diluted dose in the afternoon, on the way back. At that point, his body and core would be full of soul mana, right after the hunt ended. This meant he had to cleanse his pure core in the morning, but he couldn't do that in plain sight. People might notice the mana circulating in his abdomen. Consequently, he waited until he reached the 2nd level to finally swallow the expensive elixir. "It's tougher than I thought," he groaned. Cleansing one's core required a lot of focus, and it was his first time trying it on the move. Making a mistake wasn't necessarily dangerous, but it could easily waste some of the elixir's efficacy. At least the starry workers don't attack unprovoked. He didn't know if it was different on the upper floors, but he didn't have to worry about them bothering him right now. By the time he met up with Mickey, the elixir in his stomach had been used up. Percy estimated he'd wasted about 20%, which wasn't ideal. He sure hoped he'd get better at this soon. It can't be helped. It's a useful skill to have anyway. Most experienced mages learned this at some point. People like Baldy couldn't afford to waste half an hour sitting still every day. Come to think of it, can't I also unblock my channels on the move? It would be impossible to do that during a fight, but most of his time was spent traveling atop the giant fungi. In fact, whenever they finished a batch of wasps, Mickey provided him with a ton of mana, so his current difficulty in regenerating it by himself wouldn't be an issue. Of course, he needed the soul mana to recover, but it wouldn't be lost when he unblocked a channel. It would still be in his body, available to be used later. Doing that while having circulation active is going to be such a chore though. He grimaced. Like this, Percy would essentially be using every second productively. Waking up, traveling to the fungal spire while cleansing his second core, killing a batch of wasps, clearing his channels while moving to the next batch, repeating the last 2 steps for the whole day, returning to the guild while cleansing his first core, exchanging his points and buying potions and elixirs, spending an hour in the library, sleeping. His routine would only change slightly once a month when he sent out a new clone. At that point, he'd have to take a break from hunting, but it would also be his best chance to put more time into studying, so he wasn't going to waste it. He frowned. Strictly speaking, this was arguably torture. However, if he stuck to it, he'd be making rapid progress towards multiple goals. Whenever he reached one of them, he'd be able to relax somewhat. Eventually, using the elixirs while walking would become effortless. Also, after mastering circulation with his second core, he wouldn't have to worry about it either. Plus, he could reconsider hunting on the 3rd level at that point. And these were just the short-term milestones. One of his clones was bound to stumble upon something interesting sooner or later. Not to mention that once he became an alchemist, he might be able to stop hunting entirely. And even if everything else failed, his second core should advance to orange in a little over 3 years too. Although he sure hoped another of his projects would bear fruit before then. Percy grinned. Pain is temporary. Gains are forever. Chapter 53, 3 Pillars. One of the guild's largest buildings stood before Percy. It was made out of the same polished stones as all the houses and shops, covered from top to bottom in intricate glyphs, shimmering faintly whenever the colorful motes landed on them. He'd walked past the library many times since joining, although he'd never entered, and he wasn't alone in that. Apparently very few people ever bothered, as it wasn't the easiest way to learn alchemy. Let's do this then. My time here is limited after all. At least the place was always open, so he wouldn't have to tailor his schedule to any inconvenient opening hours. He only needed to press his badge against a rune to be allowed inside. As soon as he gazed upon the countless towering bookcases, his heart began racing. Gods! I've missed reading. It used to be his main pastime growing up, but he'd been too busy over the last couple of years. Glancing around the room, he saw 2 middle-aged men dressed in blue, sitting on different tables. Each had a pile of books by their side. However, both had stopped what they were doing, giving him strange looks. What? Did I do something wrong? On closer inspection, one of them was the guy who'd given him the introductory lecture a month earlier. Percy never caught his name, but he did feel grateful for the freebie. He walked up to him with a smile on his face. In his experience, the man was approachable, and he could use some help finding what he needed. "Good evening, sir," he whispered to avoid bothering the other guy who'd returned to reading by now. "Did something happen outside?" the alchemist asked in concern, skipping the pleasantries. Percy furrowed his brow. "No." "Why do you ask?" The man stared at him in confusion for a few moments. "I see. It's just that I can't remember the last time I saw anybody under a century old in here." Percy smiled wryly.
Yeah, no shit.
"Well, I'm currently broke, so this is my only means of getting into alchemy," he said. "Actually, I wanted to thank you for that lesson you gave recently. I was hoping you could point me to some suitable books for beginners. If it's not too much trouble, of course." The man's expression brightened like the morning sun as soon as alchemy was brought up. "Don't mention it. As I said back then, the guild can use as many alchemists as we can get. It brings me great joy whenever I see young people willing to delve into the field." Standing up, the man hurriedly walked to a certain corner of the room, motioning him to follow. "Sadly, these are all the books we have on the subject." He gestured to an old, dusty bookcase. Seriously, these were less than 5% of the books in the building. Pretty neglected too, compared to everything else. "What about the rest?" The alchemist chuckled. "History, geography, politics, novels, those are a lot more popular. Only old people frequent this place, and most of them are already experienced alchemists after all." Percy nodded. The thing about a world as old as Remir was that there was never a lack of material for people to read and write about. Countless wars took place every year between the various noble houses. Alliances, betrayals, epic battles. If there was one thing authors and bards alike never had to worry about, it was sources of inspiration to draw from. "I suggest you start with these for now," the man said, breaking him out of his thoughts. Next, he handed him 4 leather-bound tomes, one after another. The stack might have felt heavy if he was still at red. "Feel free to ask me if you have any questions. I spend most of my nights in here." The implication made Percy's heart skip a beat. It would be rude to keep bothering the alchemist if he never offered. But now things were different. Between the books, the potion, and the elder's help, wasn't this like getting another free lesson? "Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Just call me Orin," the man replied, already returning to his table. Following suit, Percy picked another vacant spot before setting down the books. Next, he removed them from the pile, laying them side by side, before blowing at them, raising a cloud of dust in the process. "When was the last time anybody read these?" he thought amidst coughs. In any case, he could finally make out their titles. Common reagents, flowers, herbs, and minerals. Known recipes for elixirs. A guide to brewing. The 3 pillars of nectar purification. Percy decided to start with the last one, assuming it was the most fundamental. With less than half an hour left, he doubted he'd get far tonight, so he didn't waste the enlightenment potion. Opening the tome, he quickly skimmed through the fluff in the first few pages before his eyes settled on something interesting. And thus, the central idea is to process the nectar into a form more suitable for core purification. In its raw state, the beast mana would run amok, causing great damage over a few seconds. What we want instead is to alter some of its properties so that it can be used safely and effectively. These transformations are separated into distinct categories, which are formally called the 3 pillars. Percy was glad to have started with this one. He still didn't fully understand what the brewing process involved, so learning about specific ingredients and recipes should come later. Reading on, he soon found the definitions he was interested in. The first pillar is the pacification of the nectar. Simply put, it involves a class of materials that cause the beast mana to act in a delayed manner, allowing the elixirs to be slowly used over several minutes instead of rampaging in one's core within a handful of seconds. I bet it's the same thing they use to make the rejuvenation potions work overnight, contrary to the healing potions. Percy realized. But there was more there, so he continued. The second pillar is the redirection of the nectar. This step involves adding materials which make the beast mana react more strongly to the impurities found in a core, rather than the core itself. As for the third pillar, it is called deattunement. If it wasn't for this, the beast mana would counteract the user's mana, wasting the effect of the elixir before it even reached one's core. Deattunement allows the nectar to blend peacefully with another affinity, so that it can be safely guided from one's stomach to their sternum. Percy reread the text a few more times to make sure he understood everything. Pacification, redirection, and deattunement. I guess all the various recipes just substitute a different ingredient for each of the 3 pillars. Almost out of time, he quickly dove back into the book to make as much progress as possible. Naturally, each of the 3 pillars is essential to the brewing process, but they do not come without a cost. Every time the nectar is mixed with a different ingredient, some of the beast mana is lost. And this exchange has to occur thrice in each session. Beginners often struggle to get past even one of the steps without wasting the nectar. An alchemist's skill is quantified based on how much elixir they manage to retain by the end of the third one. The book went on to divulge some general information about the 3 pillars and what types of plants tended to fall into each category. As expected, dozens of known ingredients were suitable for each step, giving rise to thousands of recipes. That said, about 80% of the process was transferable from one recipe to another. Some plants required special handling, introducing some additional variable, but for the most part there was no clear winner among the recipes. It was just a question of what materials were available and what the alchemist was most familiar with. "I wish I could stay longer," he sighed. Even though he had yet to delve into alchemy proper, Percy had still enjoyed reading up on the theory. Sadly, he couldn't extend today's session without affecting tomorrow's hunt. Returning the books to the shelf, he gave Orin an apologetic smile before leaving. The man frowned upon seeing him go so early, A few minutes later, he made it home. After showering, he drank the rejuvenation potion and went to bed. Staring up at his ceiling, he thought back to Oren's disappointed expression as he bade him farewell. He probably thinks I got bored after half an hour. Percy smiled bitterly. But there was nothing he could do about it. Actions spoke louder than words, and besides, I'll be back. Chapter 54, Oren. Lukewarm. If Oren had to pick a word to describe his life, it would be that. He enjoyed what he did, of course, enough to forget about the bitterness in his past. But his daily routine hadn't changed much in a long time. It had been several centuries since he left home to join the guild as an aspiring alchemist. He still missed his family from time to time, his house having long been destroyed. Not being there for his parents and sister in their final moments was one of his few regrets. Still, he understood he couldn't have changed much even if he'd stayed. Born with an orange core, Oren hadn't even reached Greenback when the disaster struck. His only solace was he didn't have to worry about the brutality running rampant across Remir as long as he remained within the walls of the guild. Nobody dared to stir trouble under the noses of both the Divine Order and the great houses. Even better was he'd found his true calling here. Harnessing nature for humanity's sake, using the raw nectar to refine elixirs, Remir's lifeblood, was Oren's greatest passion in life. Something about the art truly resonated with him. Perhaps it was the respect it garnered from mortals and gods alike. Maybe it was the satisfaction he drew knowing he personally contributed to his world's survival. Or it could just be that challenging himself to improve every day, to find new ways of increasing his yield, was a ton of fun. In fact, if there was one thing the old codger liked as much as brewing, it was mentoring youngsters and passing along the art to the next generation. If only they cared half as much to learn. The guild didn't exactly lack manpower. Sure, they couldn't provide for the Redborns of Remir, but who cared about them anyway? There were plenty of elixirs to go around for the Orangeborns and above. Plus, new members kept joining the guild in droves. Most of them picked up alchemy too sooner or later. Even the lazier ones eventually managed to save up enough points. However, Oren had a soft spot for the rare few who bothered learning the art properly, paying as much attention to the underlying theory as they did for demonstrations and lessons. That was why he'd been so excited when he first saw Percy in the library. Sure, the boy had probably been driven there by his empty pockets, not a pure appreciation for the subject. Still, it warmed Oren's heart to see somebody diving into the books in earnest. The others who only blindly copied their elders rarely surpassed a yield of 35%. They also never brought any new insights into the field, causing it to stagnate. So great had his enthusiasm been, that his dejection had been equally grand seeing the boy give up mere minutes after starting. Just like the rest of them, he'd thought at the time. But to Oren's great shock, the boy had returned the next day, at about the same time, if a few minutes earlier perhaps. Percy had picked up the books again, resuming exactly where he had left off. The old alchemist hadn't missed the youngster swallowing a dose of a red potion too. He'd recognized it, of course. Oren had brewed a lot of the guild's potions personally. Not many of his peers cared much about this lesser branch of alchemy. Smart. This is one of the best uses for the enlightenment potions. It was only at that point Oren realized Percy hadn't left the previous night out of boredom, but necessity. Over the following few days, he paid more attention to the context clues. Percy always arrived at the library at around the same time, just before midnight. He never stayed longer than an hour, but he always had a distraught expression when leaving. Clearly, the boy wanted to keep reading, but had to cut his trips short. His eyes were also tired the whole time. There was never a speck of dust on the young man's orange robe, the self-cleaning runes doing their job admirably. But Oren didn't miss the traces of dried sweat all over his face. He spends all day hunting, Oren had realized. It wasn't that strange for a new member to spend a lot of time on the spire. It was common for newcomers to do that. After all, it was the easiest way to save up enough points before switching to alchemy. That said, the vast majority were Orangeborns who didn't need more than 8 to 10 hours of work to cover their needs. This was his first time meeting a boy who was not only willing to learn the art the hard way, but who struggled to find enough time for it. The revelation made his heart quiver, to the point he no longer minded offering to answer Percy's questions. Originally, Oren had regretted the words as soon as they'd left his mouth. He'd volunteered to mentor others in the past, but that never went well. The youngsters tended to ask simple questions at first. However, they kept demanding more and more, until eventually it all turned into a one-to-one lesson, with Oren spoon-feeding them everything. But that wasn't what Percy did. For the most part, the boy had done his best to study by himself. Even when he seemed stuck, he went back to the books, trying to figure out the answer on his own. Very rarely did he take Oren up on his offer and, even then, he only asked specific questions related to the problem he was facing. Over time, the old man truly came to appreciate Percy's work ethic and his dedication. The boy never missed a day, although he only used a potion every other night. Apparently, it was the most he could afford. Once a month, the young man seemed to take a break from hunting for a few days. Oren was curious, but he didn't ask, respecting the boy's privacy. Percy almost lived in the library during those days, taking the opportunity to get a lot more reading done than usual. Sadly, he didn't use the potions at that time, as they didn't last very long, and he didn't have the funds to keep guzzling them down one after another. He also seemed to endure some headaches during those days. Maybe he suffered from some chronic illness? In any case, Oren had come to lament Percy's lower grade. He felt it was a true injustice that such a hard-working young man was cursed with the lowest birthright on Remir. Then again, perhaps it was a blessing. Maybe the boy wouldn't have been so passionate about learning if he'd grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth like the rest. Either way, the young man kept visiting the library night after night, month after month. Through the scarce scraps of time he could invest into alchemy, Percy slowly devoured all the books Oren recommended, even rereading a couple of them. Eventually, the old alchemist watched the boy return the final book to its shelf, his expression an odd cocktail of triumph and dejection. "Congratulations, Percy," he said. "You've read everything we have on alchemy." "Thank you, sir. I couldn't have made it this far without your help." Oren shook his head. "I didn't do much. I barely gave you a couple tips here and there. What do you plan to do next? I bet you're itching to try brewing an elixir yourself, aren't you?" The boy smiled bitterly but didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 6 months, Oren said. Percy tilted his head. "I'll provide the materials you need for the next 6 months, 4 hours per day. You can keep any elixir you manage to brew too, so even if your yield is horrible at the start, you might be able to make up for the shorter hunting trips in due time." The boy's jaw slackened. Oren chuckled at the sight. Only about a minute later did Percy seem to find the words. "Sir, I can't express how grateful I am, but may I ask why?" Oren shrugged. "Why not? I'm filthy rich. It won't really affect me if I buy you some nectar." Percy still appeared confused. "I mean, I get that. Still, wouldn't it be cheaper if you gave some more free lectures like before? That way, a lot more people would benefit than just me." The old alchemist scoffed. "I could do that, but why bother? Most of those kids can afford the lessons and the materials by themselves if they put a tiny bit more effort. I'd rather help the one who actually needs it." Percy's eyes glistened with tears. He looked like he was about to hug him too. Oren chuckled, placing his hand on the boy's forehead to keep him at bay. "But I meant it when I said it's only for 6 months. There's no guarantee you'll manage to brew any elixir by then. What you get out of this is up to you." Chapter 55, A Message from a God. Percy's past few weeks had been rough, to say the least. His last clone had been another dud just like the 5 before it. He'd found himself in the body of a fish that barely survived an hour before getting eaten. By a crab too. The memory still made his blood boil. At this point, he wasn't sure if he'd been lucky with his first 2 clones, or unlucky with the rest. Probably both. However, that was where the bad news ended. Last night, he finished the alchemy books, and Oren generously offered to sponsor him for half a year. It really was like the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, as he'd been trying to figure out how to fund his studies for a while now. His hunting trips had capped out at 32 kills per day since 3 months ago, with no further improvements in sight. At least, He could now afford both Mickey's rejuvenation potions and the ones he needed to study, but he still struggled to save up any more points past that. At this rate, he'd be stuck until he managed to use circulation with both cores. That said, he'd made some progress towards that. He'd already finished clearing the rest of his channels and even mastered drinking the elixirs while moving. His soul had also grown a lot stronger after sending so many clones. Right now, using his bloodline didn't cause any new tiers to form, other than the large chunk he carved out deliberately, of course. The only steps left were to temper the channels to their limits and figure out a suitable pattern for the soul mana to flow in. Of course, there were some issues there, but he hoped he'd solve them in due time. Still, Auron's help was the key to delving into alchemy a lot sooner than he could have otherwise. Percy hoped his strong theoretical background would let him reach the minimum thresholds more easily than other newbies. I have to make Auron's funding count. I need to reach a 15% yield by the end. Losing only half the value of the materials is going to sting less. Percy stopped in front of a stone house, slightly larger than his own. Senior alchemists who had contributed a lot to the guild were given an upgraded home with its own private alchemy lab. The rest had to make do with the public ones. Luckily, Percy's mentor had offered him his own. He was even going to guide him through the process. Well, only for his first few attempts, but it was still massive. I can't believe I'm finally doing this for real. Reading about alchemy for so long without being able to put the lessons to practice had been quite frustrating, to say the least. It was like baking cakes without being allowed a bite. Or in my case, I suppose I wasn't even able to bake the cakes. Just memorizing the recipes. He chuckled. He was about to knock on the door, when something unexpected happened. A shockwave coursed through him, making all the buildings around him tremble slightly. A gentle but firm breeze soon followed, sending all the motes in the air flying to the south. Percy squinted as a few landed in his eyes in quick succession. What's going on? Auron's door opened, the man walking out of his house with an equally perplexed expression. The same happened with a few of his neighbors, the ones who were at home presumably. Everyone just stood outside, trying to make sense of the event. Percy had never seen anything like this since joining the guild, and from what he gathered, neither had these seniors. Is somebody dumb enough to attack us? He asked his mentor. It was only now that the old alchemist even registered he was there. He gave him a reassuring smile, before shrugging. I doubt it, but even if some house has gone crazy, there's nothing to worry about. We have 5 violet cores stationed here, so even a great house would struggle to do much. Percy nodded, but he still wasn't fully convinced. Attention, denizens of Remier. This is a message broadcast by Hermes, one of the 12 gods of the Divine Order, a booming voice said. The young man couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. It was as if it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. As if each pebble on the ground and each speck of dust in the air was eager to relay the god's will. Today is a joyous day for our world, Hermes continued, oblivious to Percy's thoughts. As you all know, our order is constantly at war with other races. A war over land, lives, and resources. Usually, these conflicts do not spill over to the rest of you, the mortals of Remier, but a recent development has granted us a grand opportunity that we can share with some of you. Odd exclamations followed from the alchemists surrounding Percy. Everyone knew the order often came across unique treasures with miraculous powers. However, they tended to monopolize them among themselves. Some people weren't happy with that arrangement, but honestly, Percy understood where the gods were coming from. After all, they were the ones who fought tooth and nail to protect them all. Plus, they were their spoils of war, so they did deserve to keep them. You may be wondering why we're being so generous all of a sudden, but that will become clear once I describe the properties of this bizarre item we have recently procured. It's called the Lotus of a Myriad Rivers. Although, strictly speaking, it's not the lotus itself we're in possession of, but the seed of one. In any case, as you may imagine, this object is not native to Remier. It's something we've competed against rival races to obtain from a recently vanquished world. And its effect is something you've all dreamt of at some point in your lives. No, scratch that. This is something that we've all dreamt about, including many of our gods. After all, Once the lotus fully blossoms, it can change one's affinity. It was Percy's turn to draw a sharp breath at that revelation. This was something that had truly bothered him ever since he discovered his second core's affinity. He'd long hypothesized he might be able to find a solution out there in his travels. But he couldn't have predicted the solution would present itself to him back at home in such a manner. I have to get this at all costs. Now here's the catch. As the name of the plant implies, you can't exactly get whatever affinity piques your fancy. Once consumed, a petal of the lotus will add a water affinity to one's core. According to our current understanding, it won't do anything if you already possess the water affinity. Neither will it work with the rare or composite ones. However, it does work with other elemental affinities, merging with them. In other words, if you have a fire or earth affinity, you will end up with steam or mud respectively, and so on. Percy grimaced at that. Those who lacked an affinity like him were already 20% of the population, but now he'd also have to compete with those with fire, earth, air, or lightning. It meant about 84% of the people on Remir would want a petal. Yes, as you have probably realized, almost everyone you know can use it. As fate would have it, there's plenty of it to go around, however. Once again, the name of the treasure might have already clued you in, but the lotus will generate a total of 10,000 petals when it blooms. And, lucky you, we currently only have about 7,000 members in the order who can benefit from it. In theory, we could delay planting the seed until we have more people, but nobody knows how long that would take, as we can't exactly control the rate by which talented individuals are born. Plus, we are firmly of the philosophy that the treasure won't do us any good if we keep it in storage forever. So, we have already planted it, and the petals will be available for us all in 5 short years. A blink of an eye for us gods, and even the more competent of you mortals. Still a long time for the red-born runts, though. The god chuckled. Percy didn't appreciate somehow being the butt of a joke even during a divine transmission, but he was excited enough to let it slide. Ah, and just in case you smartass think we haven't considered storing the excess petals for later surprise. We are not as dumb as you think. Sadly, they will wither away into nothing exactly 23 days, 7 hours, 12 minutes and 45.2 seconds after the plant blooms, no matter what we do. There is no preservation array that can change that. Even time dilation won't work. It's actually the first time we, Remir specifically, got our hands on this bad boy, but other races have documented trying to cheat the system, only to end up crying over the wasted petals. This time, the crowd around Percy erupted into cheers. Of course, everyone understood they probably wouldn't be among the lucky few to get a petal, but there was still plenty to be excited about. The news that the Divine Order had achieved another important victory gave them all some peace of mind. And after this, their world would grow stronger still. Yes, we are amazing and all that, Hermes said after a couple of minutes. In any case, I'm running out of juice for the spell, so let me wrap this up real quick. To summarize, we have this neat thing in the oven that will give anyone with a pure or elemental affinity an upgrade 5 years from now. There are about 3,000 spots we are willing to share and around 1,000 noble houses on Remir. We could have tried to come up with a more elaborate system to decide who gets them, but frankly, we don't give a shit. So we'll just hand 3 petals to each house and they can do whatever with them. Even if you're a commoner, it doesn't necessarily mean you are screwed. You can still try buttering up one of the houses if you've got anything of value to give them, but that's your problem, not mine. Bye-bye. Chapter 56, Calm Before the Storm. Careful. Careful. Stir it. Stir it. Percy followed his mentor's instructions, picking up the pace. However, before he even got the chance to celebrate the broken lumps, more bubbles began to form in the cauldron. Shit! It took him a couple seconds too long to remember what he was supposed to do. Brushing his fingers over the rune controlling the temperature, he hurriedly dialed it down a notch, but the mixture was already threatening to boil over. SSSS. A few drops landed outside, soon evaporating into wisps of steam, causing Percy's heart to clench. Each of those was a wasted contribution point. Pinching a touch of powder from a bowl, he tossed it into the concoction, causing the bubbles to die down more quickly. Of course, this wasn't without cost. Every mistake he made either killed some of the elixir's efficacy directly or delayed the process, indirectly resulting in a lower yield. Well, that was positively atrocious, Oren said a few minutes later, staring at the useless sludge in the cauldron. Percy plopped down on a chair, before wiping the sweat off his brow. He was too embarrassed to look his mentor in the eyes. The alchemist chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "Don't let this get to you, kid. This was your first time trying this. You should have seen me back when I was starting out. It took me a month just to get through the pacification step. I'm sure you'll get it down within the week." Percy sighed. Brewing an elixir was nothing like reading about it in a book. There were a ton of things that could go wrong with each attempt, and it was an alchemist's job to deal with any issues that came up promptly and effectively. If he had to explain alchemy to an amateur, Percy would liken it to a song played by two clueless musicians, the nectar and the secondary ingredient. In this analogy, the alchemist was like the conductor who had to somehow fix the shoddy performance, blending the dissonant tunes into something acceptable. No matter what he did, it would never sound good, but he could minimize both the duration of the piece and the number of mistakes that slipped through to spare the audience's ears from the pain. Or, in this case, to spare my wallet from the loss. It wasn't like the recipes outlined everything perfectly either. The nectar was an organic product, and it wasn't homogeneous from one vial to the next. There were subtle differences not only between wasps, but even a pair of drops coming from the same gland. Consequently, no two brewing sessions would ever go the same. Percy had to learn to recognize problems before they even manifested, relying on various clues such as faint odors or minor changes in the color of the mixture. And I have to preserve over 2/3 of the nectar after each step, if I want to end up with a 25% yield. Let's stop here for today. Technically, we've got some time left, but I can see you're still rattled by the god's message, Oren said, breaking him out of his thoughts. Percy didn't deny it. He'd known about the existence of gods his whole life, but he'd never seen one in person. Well, that was still true, of course, but he had experienced one spell today, and it was truly eye-opening. Hermes had somehow affected the whole world with his magic. Sure, it wasn't some apocalyptic spell bringing ruin and destruction on Remir or anything crazy, just straightforward transmission magic. However, Percy still had difficulty picturing the insane amount of mana it should have required. And then, there were the god's words. The deity definitely seemed a little long-winded and downright eccentric. Percy didn't know if that was a common side effect of divinity. That said, it was the substance of the message that interested him the most. In 5 years, I'll have a chance to fix my second affinity. It was still going to be difficult, but not impossible. He didn't have to worry about the 7,000 petals the Divine Order would keep to themselves, or the other nearly 3,000 handed to the rest of Remir. He merely had to snatch one of the 3 spots in his own house. The good news was, of the 500 people in his family, about 60% had been born with the life affinity. He only had to compete with the remaining 200. In fact, there were even fewer, considering 16% already had a water affinity. Elaine and Gawain came to mind. However, there weren't many Redborns left in their family. Most of those 170 eligible people had a stronger claim to the treasure than him. Yeah, if it comes down to it, I'll trade circulation for it. He'd rather not deal with the fallout of such a rash move, but he wouldn't pass up a one-in-a-lifetime opportunity just to keep a secret. In any case, he had 5 years to figure something out. "Sir, are you going to compete for a petal too?" Oren appeared to ponder over his question for a few moments. "I could, but I don't think I will, no." "Why not?" "Well, Hermes didn't say anything about giving the guild any petals. That's probably because all our members are nobles, so they can all just go back to their family for the event. However, my house was destroyed a long time ago. But you're a senior alchemist, and forgive me for putting it so bluntly, but you've said it yourself that you're loaded. Surely you can cut a deal with one of the smaller houses." Oren nodded. "Indeed, that's why I said I could do it. And truth be told, it would be fun to upgrade my fire affinity to steam. It would certainly give me a fun toy to play around in my old age. Ha ha ha. But it won't affect my alchemy, and I can't even remember the last time I got into a fight. I don't really need this, so I'd rather leave it for somebody who does. What about you? Percy smiled wryly. I have a soul affinity already. Also, I can think of an uncle or two who would lose their shit if a Redborn like me got a petal. Lying to his mentor, even if only by omission, felt wrong. Especially given how much Oren had done for him. But Percy hadn't known him for long, so he couldn't risk telling him about his second core. He'd already reported his soul affinity to the guild too. On paper, he had neither the need nor the means to compete for a petal, so he'd have to play the part. Percy, Oren spoke in a somber tone. Don't leave the guild in the next 5 years. Huh? Why not? The young man asked. This announcement sounds like a good thing, and, well, it is a good thing for the most part, the old alchemist said before elaborating. However, it will also bring a lot of chaos in the foreseeable future. It's better to stay out of trouble until it all blows over. Percy wasn't sure he understood. Back when he heard the message, he did consider the noble houses might intensify their conflicts over the petals. However, he quickly concluded they wouldn't. After all, Hermes said every house would get 3 of them. He didn't say you'd get more if you destroyed a rival family. That would be a barbaric message to send. Wouldn't it? I know what you're thinking, but there are plenty of ways to tiptoe around it. For example, what if one house annexed another without destroying it? Or kidnapped important hostages to use as leverage? People have done worse things than that over the centuries. There's no telling how low some families are willing to stoop in the face of such a treasure. Percy swallowed a lump of saliva. If this was true, the world outside the guild's walls was going to become even more dangerous than usual. After all, the majority of blue and violet cord mages on Remir could instantly grow stronger with a petal, elevating their house's status. Naturally, they'd do everything to get more of them. Thanks for the warning, sir. I have no intention of going anywhere anytime soon, Percy said. Another half-truth. He'd have to return home before the 5 years were up. However, that was some time away. He wasn't even remotely close to meeting his goals in the guild just yet. In fact, he'd barely even begun tackling them. After bidding his mentor farewell, Percy leisurely strolled to his place. Since the brewing session had finished earlier than expected, he had some time to kill. It wasn't enough to go back to the spire, and he was already used to sleeping less, so he didn't feel the need to go to bed either. Instead, he was going to deal with something else that had been bothering him for a while. Chapter 57 Nesha. A ray of sunlight pierced through the blockade, causing her eyelid to twitch. Evidently, even the extra layer of clothes she had clumsily draped over the curtain wasn't perfect. But alas, she couldn't be asked to adjust it. The girl ignored the disturbance, shifting on her pillow. A couple seconds later, she was asleep again. It was noon the next time she woke up. The intensity of her headache clued her in. Nesha was a bit of an expert in that department. Her body refused to remain asleep any longer, regardless of how hard she pushed. She'd already rested way longer than necessary, but it wasn't like there was a point to getting up. With a shrug, she remained there, staring at the ceiling for another hour. Only when her stomach grumbled did she begrudgingly reach for the glasses on the nightstand. Practically dragging her feet along the stone floor, Nesha made her way to the preservation box. She grabbed a couple oranges, the first things she saw, before peeling them with her mana. Tossing a segment into her mouth, she bit down a little too hard, accidentally sending some juice down her chin. It was a bit too sour for her taste, causing her brow to pucker up. She was also getting sick of eating the same 5 things over and over. Technically, Nesha knew how to cook. Her father, the patriarch of the Veritas house, had made sure her maids taught her. A lot of good it did me, she chuckled. Or him. Born with an orange core, she'd never been destined to succeed Janos as the new leader, nor to become a powerful mage. That said, she did have 2 gifts that were of value to her family. The first was the bloodline. It didn't matter how high her grade was, or what affinity she had, the truth-seeker ability worked the same way regardless. That's why she had been brought up learning about trade and psychology. The second was that she was a woman, and she could have made for a useful chip to be given away in a political marriage. Sadly for Janos, things hadn't gone according to plan. Backstabbed by his allies, the man had seen his house crumble before his very eyes. His last, and one of the few acts of love towards his daughter had been to send her to the guild to seek asylum. It took Nesha another half an hour to dress up and reach the door. Why do I even bother? She wondered as she headed toward her stand. Nesha didn't really care about the contribution points. Her course advancement wasn't a priority for her, nor had she any interest in alchemy. Supposedly, her space affinity could have made her good at hunting, but there was no way she'd ever be powerful enough to hurt her enemies, the ones who ruined her life, by herself. Perhaps, she harbored hope of finding a different way to enact her revenge. Maybe, deep down, she believed she could hire assassins or something if she amassed enough wealth. Either way, it was a pipe dream, but she could work on it in her own way. She wasn't going to waste her time killing the wasps one at a time to collect nectar like a brute. Nor was she going to get her hands dirty brewing elixirs. If there was one thing she was confident about, it was her ability to get rich in a more sophisticated manner. Slow and steady. And yeah, she wasn't exactly in a rush either. Reaching her stand, she took out 5 jars filled with orange and yellow coins, placing them next to her. Nesha could have emptied them at home, of course, but she'd brought the money here intentionally. She understood giving the appearance of a successful business was the key to attracting even more customers. It was why it had taken her longer than she'd liked at the beginning. Then, she rested her face on the counter, forcing herself to take another nap. A few minutes later, a young man in yellow approached. Nesha caught him eyeing the jars, but she wasn't worried. Nobody was stupid enough to steal in the guild in broad daylight. Selling or buying? She asked. The man smirked at her. Selling. I found a place with dozens of starry soldiers clustered together somewhere on the 3rd level. I can tell you the exact location for 50 points. Nesha didn't even spare him a glance. Not interested. She resumed her nap. The guy slammed his fist next to her. What bullshit business are you running, you bastard? Are you buying information? Or not? Nesha ignored him. Neither did the passers-by. Everyone was familiar with his type. After receiving no response for a few seconds, the bastard stuck out his tongue before walking away. More people approached her in irregular intervals. Many tried to sell, but very few of them were honest. Some were willing to spend a few coins on information. Almost everyone was interested in the 3rd level. It wasn't like there weren't green cores in the guild, but most of them were veterans who knew the ropes well. Nesha hadn't made much money from them since she expanded her business to the 4th level. Maybe it's time to switch things up. She'd known from the beginning brokering information on the Spire wouldn't be very profitable. That said, it had been less of a hassle to start with. At least, it didn't require an initial capital nor too much effort. Still, Nesha had amassed more than enough money for her next step. At this point, she was just procrastinating. Fine, I'll do it. Another guy approached, drawing her attention. She recognized him. Although she hadn't socialized much in the guild, the boy had made a slight impression as the only Redborn in her orientation. Since then, she often watched him walk by. He almost never missed a day from hunting. Nesha couldn't recall seeing him leave. He probably tended to head out early, but she did spot him on the way back nearly every night. What does he want, though? Is he going to offer me information on the 2nd level? Who would even buy that? The young man stopped before her. He was holding something under his arm, a wide plank of wood. Hello there.
I'm Percy.
You might not remember me, but we joined on the same day. Nesha nodded, still waiting to see what he wanted. In any case, I've noticed you've been using this shoddy sign for a while. I had some free time today, so I figured I could help appear out. He then shifted the plank, showing her its contents. It basically read the same as her current one, but the words had been carved with more care, and it did away with the patchwork. She raised an eyebrow. In her experience, there were only 2 reasons he'd do this. Either he saw her business growing and wanted to ingratiate himself with her, or like a typical guy, he wanted to get in her pants. And frankly, Nesha wasn't interested in either. Why? She asked, barely masking her irritation. The boy, Percy, exhaled before speaking. Okay. I know it will sound weird, but I have something to confess. Nesha smirked. And there it is. Just spill it out so I can tell you to fuck off. So, I keep seeing your sign every time I return from the spire and kinda irks me. He smiled wryly. I mean, no offense or anything, but I'd rather look at this one. Her jaw slackened at the revelation. She was about to call him out on his bullshit excuse, but her bloodline corroborated his words. The madman was telling the truth. Hello? I hope I haven't overstepped or anything. You don't have to use it if you don't want. He said after a while. Ah, no. Leave it. Thanks, I guess. No worries. The young man waved at her, already walking to the plump guy's stand. What a strange boy. Shrugging, she picked up the new sign. It really did look better than the other one. Also, there was more space at the bottom. Pulling the nails from the stand, she removed the previous sign, replacing it with the one Percy had given her. Then, she flipped the old one around, as she carved some new words on it with her mana, before clumsily patching it under the new sign. Giving it one last look, she nodded in satisfaction. It read, buying and selling information on the 3rd and 4th levels. Also gambling. Chapter 58 Soul Channels. I can't believe she couldn't even wait a week. Carving that sign for the drowsy girl hadn't taken him longer than 10 minutes. It wasn't a big deal for him, but it had only proven just how lazy she was, having not bothered to do it herself after so many months. In any case, Percy had considered it a great investment of his time. The sheer satisfaction he'd draw by not having to look at that abomination every day would pay dividends for a while. Or so he'd thought. One could only imagine his shock upon seeing his work desecrated with a new patch the very next morning. At least I got some useful information out of it. Apparently not one who liked owing people, the girl had called him over the following night, giving him a free tip to thank him for the donation. She'd informed Percy of a location on the northwestern side of the fungal spire to be wary of. On a map of the 2nd level, she'd circled a couple dozen mushrooms, telling him to avoid wandering there by mistake. In terms of elevation, those platforms were much higher than the rest of the 2nd level, bringing them closer to the 3rd. Consequently, starry soldiers were known to roam those mushrooms, making them extremely dangerous for an orange core like Percy. However, they were considered part of the 2nd level on paper, because they could only be accessed from below. Their closest neighbors on the 3rd level were too far away, making it impractical to build bridges between them. Good to know. He'd grinned at the time. The girl's Nesha had only told him out of concern for his safety, but Percy had heard something entirely different from what she'd intended. He could hunt starry soldiers on the 2nd level. His profits had plateaued for a while now, and he was already considering giving the yellow beasts a shot sooner or later. What worried him the most was he wouldn't be able to hunt them while keeping all his trump cards secret, and the 3rd level was always crowded. The location Nesha had so graciously shared would let him do it with the same privacy he'd come to enjoy. I'm still not ready though. Percy understood the soldiers would rip him to shreds as he was. He'd only consider approaching them once he could use circulation with both cores. Sadly, his results in that department were rather mixed. He'd already finished clearing his 2nd set of channels, and he was currently busy tempering them. This was the easiest step, as it only involved pushing mana through them, forcing them to expand little by little until they couldn't grow any wider. It was the next and final step that stumped him, however. Is it even possible to use circulation with soul mana? Percy had known from the very beginning that each affinity introduced its own variables into the technique, requiring some adjustments to be made. Elaine and Archibald had already learned the hard way, having unblocked a very different network of channels to his own. They'd also been forced to discover the correct pattern for their mana by themselves. In fact, his cousin had still not managed to solve the issue by the time he'd left the Avalon house. Consequently, he'd already expected his soul affinity would come with its own set of challenges. However, he couldn't have predicted just how many roadblocks he would encounter in his quest. First, there was the issue with tempering his soul rather than his body, but luckily his clones had passively helped him do that. More problems popped up back when he began unblocking the channels though. Each affinity might have its own set of pathways, but at least they were typically fixed in place. This wasn't the case for Percy. "They're like intestines," he'd noted when he first tried opening them. The ones he had cleared as a child were still okay, as they branched out from his sternum to his soul's extremities. In other words, both their ends were anchored in set locations, making these channels relatively static, much like other affinities. In his analogy, they were like the large intestine. However, the rest of his channels, the ones that looped around his soul, were a lot more fluid. Like the small intestine, they shuffled around with each bowel movement. Their connections were still fixed in relation to one another, but there was a lot of leeway for them to bend and turn, making the entire network look very different from one moment to the next. How am I even meant to find the correct pattern like this? Locating and clearing a single channel wasn't that hard, but to use circulation he had to look at all of them at the same time and find a pattern that took the whole system into account. Caw! Caw! Mickey sent him an image of his next targets, pulling him out of his thoughts. Shrugging, he began running towards the bridge. "I suppose I've still got some time left to figure this out." It would be a few more months until he finished tempering his channels. He sure hoped he'd work out the correct pattern by then. Over the next several hours, Percy absent-mindedly hunted the starry workers along with his familiar. By now, he'd been doing this for so long the arduous task was firmly embedded into his routine, keeping circulation active with his second core, tempering his soul channels, rushing from one mushroom to the next, forming his weapons, executing the bugs swiftly, feeding them to the crow, extracting the nectar from their glands. None of it required much focus, allowing him to keep thinking about the issue. Maybe what I need is a change in perspective. I've been thinking of my soul affinity in the same terms as my pure affinity, but it's clearly a different beast. From his experience traveling between worlds, Percy knew that disembodied souls tended to perceive time and space very differently from living people. In that state, a single moment could stretch into days, while a single step could bridge unfathomable distances. In the same vein, it was perhaps a mistake trying to fit his soul and its corresponding channels into the same mold as his body's. He grimaced. That's easier said than done. It wasn't like he hadn't tried sensing his soul more deeply in the past. However, inhabiting his own body was very different than drifting outside Remir, or fighting to possess others with his clones. In the latter case, his soul was but a fragment, free to move within a much larger vessel, in constant contact with an external, often hostile soul. Here, his soul existed alone, in its rightful vessel, without much space to move or anything else touching it. "Caw!" Mickey called out to him once again. Percy checked the 4 vials in his pocket. 3 were filled to the brim with nectar as the 4th one was a little over halfway there. The sun was also about to set. "Shit! I'm going to be late." Handing his familiar a rejuvenation potion, he bid him farewell in a hurry, before drinking a diluted elixir and rushing back to the guild. It was still his first week brewing under Oren's supervision, and he didn't want to keep his mentor waiting. After entering the settlement, he sprinted to the old alchemist's house. He did grab a honey roll, only because he was so hungry he might faint during the session otherwise, but he didn't have time for a chat with Freddy tonight. Nor would he visit the official stores today. Due to alchemy eating into his schedule, he was already earning less than 400 points per hunt, so he no longer needed to stop by every night. He barely managed to swallow the last bite of his meal by the time he made it to Oren's door. He downed the enlightenment potion too while waiting for the man to open. "Another busy day?" his mentor asked with a smile after seeing his student out of breath once more. Percy nodded, having already flushed out all thoughts of souls and mana channels out of his mind, replacing them with a different set of problems. Right now, the only thing he was thinking about was how to mix those damn ingredients properly. Making his way to the cauldron, he rolled up his sleeves, fully aware he was going to get his ass kicked here too. But he wouldn't let this bother him. Taking a deep breath, he prepared himself before tossing the ingredients in. "I'm going to reach the top, one step at a time." Chapter 59, Floating. Percy's feelings towards his clones had shifted a lot over time. His first attempts had been defined by pain and confusion, as he hadn't had the slightest clue how his bloodline was supposed to work back then. Yet, oddly enough, those very trips to the Morais world and Huehue had proven his most successful ones by far. Suffice to say, by the time he'd developed a proper understanding of his ability, his greed and anticipation had reached an all-time high. Of course, that had only led to disappointment during his crappy adventure in the gecko's body, which was soon followed by several equally fruitless trips. That said, things had flipped around once more since then. No, he hadn't found anything else of value, but that was precisely why he had learned to lower his expectations, to the point the shitty bodies and gruesome deaths no longer bothered him. If anything, he had slowly come to appreciate the novelty of his adventures. Initially, Percy had pitted his clones, who had to endure all those hardships just so he could benefit. Nowadays, he was beginning to think it was his main body who had drawn the short end of the stick, however. I'll take freezing to death and getting eaten by crabs over picking apart one more bloody wasp. Or brewing another pot of sludge. And it was with this mindset that clone number 13 had embraced his new holiday. Things were looking up for him too. He'd found a suitable body fairly quickly, and it hadn't even resisted much, unlike clones number 9 and number 11 who had imploded before even doing anything. In fact, his new host was even more zen than the lizard, happy to relax and give him the reins. Not out of fear, just pure, unmitigated chill. Why am I spinning though? Percy tried looking down at his body, but failed to even glimpse at his limbs. A curved wall of gray fur was in the way. Ok, another beast. Shocker. But why is it so fat? Getting dizzy, he tried to stop rotating. There was nothing to grab against. Though he wasn't underwater, he'd already experienced that. And this was different. What the hell is going on? Did we fall off a cliff or something? After experimenting for a few minutes, he realized he could slow down by stretching his limbs. He still couldn't see them, but they seemed to respond to his commands all the same. He also had some damn powerful lungs, as he managed to completely halt his movements by blowing the other way. By now, he'd also verified he wasn't falling. If he were, he'd have splattered on the ground already. No, his host was floating. In the sky. That's a new one. Paying more attention to his surroundings, he soon noticed he couldn't see very far. A light brown fog partially obscured his vision. At first, he wondered whether his host had suffocated or been poisoned to death by the substance. However, he instinctively felt there was nothing wrong with it. As if inhaling the gas was the most normal thing in the world. Come to think of it, it tastes a bit like strawberry juice. Percy took a few deep breaths, enjoying the flavor. Even if it was harmful, who cared, right? Next, he remembered his purpose here, opening his status. Percival's clone. Mana cores. Mana core 1. Yellow. Beast. Mana core 2. Seed. Ew. Spells. Parting gift, crude. Ew. Grants access to your status. Incomplete. Grants the seed of a second mana core. Requires potent life mana to germinate. He nodded, not seeing anything out of place. His host was at yellow too, making him one of the luckier clones so far. Although, if there was anything of value here, he'd have to look for it. His best means of navigating the environment was to propel himself by blowing air. He didn't know if the beast had something better in its arsenal, but it refused to share if it did. Since his eyes couldn't peer through the fog, Percy activated Mana Sense, soon getting a couple readings. They were at orange, so he wasn't too concerned. Not that he had any clue how to fight in his current body, but the creatures hopefully wouldn't attack unprovoked. He cautiously approached the nearest one, a bizarre animal appearing in his sight. It looked very different to anything he'd seen, but the closest match would be a cat. Maybe. Not really. Its body was round like a ball, covered in long, pink, curly fluff. It actually looked ridiculous as it rotated slowly, without a care in the world. Every time its head spun his way, it watched him curiously, with its 3 eyes half opened and its 4 ears lazily hanging aside. Is it the same species as me? Is that what I look like? That should be it. After all, why else would it remain so calm when approached by a beast at a higher grade? Although it did appear smaller. Half his radius, maybe. Less? Percy inched closer, trying not to startle it. His worries were unfounded, though, as the furball wasn't fazed in the slightest. When he was in front of it, he shifted slightly. Roughly estimating where his paw was, he gave it a gentle shove. Was that rude? He didn't know nor care. The creature didn't mind either, continuing to inhale some fog of its own as it drifted away. Am I definitely a clone? Maybe this is just a dream. Well, dream or not, he fully intended to get his time's worth. Falling back to Mana Sense, he moved around, examining a dozen more creatures. They all looked the same, but their fur was either pink, brown, or black. He'd yet to find another gray one like himself. And they all had orange cores. Maybe my host died of old age? It would explain the different color and grade. In any case, he had to get out of the fog. Harmful or not, he could barely see past his nose. That kinda went against his goal of finding something useful. He decided to descend to the ground, when another question popped up in his mind. Does this world even have a ground? Or is it all sky? If there was any gravity, he couldn't differentiate it from the buoyancy holding him up. Not seeing any other solution, he exhaled as much air as he could, causing his body to shrivel slightly. That seemed to do the trick as he began falling a certain direction. After falling a few meters, he inhaled again to slow down. He had no idea how high he was, but he'd rather not turn into meat paste so soon. Luckily, his situation changed after a while. Now we're getting somewhere. The brown fog thinned as he descended, letting him see further. It wasn't perfect, but he could now vaguely spot land underneath him, as well as some rocky peaks in the distance. He saw more of his species floating around too. Shrugging, he continued his controlled fall with more confidence than before, stopping when he was a dozen meters from the ground. The fog still surrounded him, but it wasn't as intrusive. It's also less tasty. He frowned. No wonder the rest of the cat thingies preferred floating higher. But this wasn't the time to indulge in alien delicacies, so he simply began moving towards a random direction, parallel to the ground. Hopefully his higher vantage point would help him find something interesting soon. This was getting annoying. Percy had to blow opposite to where he wanted to go, so he was forced to turn around every few seconds. It had already been a few hours since he descended, and he'd traveled a fair distance. His higher grade helped some, although his host didn't seem to be the fastest flyer. Well, either that or he was doing something wrong. Maybe these things move by farting? He briefly entertained the idea of giving it a shot, but he shook his head. Inconvenient or not, he'd rather keep his dignity. Percy hadn't found anything either. It was just more rocky plains and hills all around him. He had no idea how far they stretched, and he hadn't seen any other living beings either. Well, besides the furballs, his species seemed to be extremely abundant in this world, or this region at least. The only slight oddity he spotted was a higher concentration of both the fog and the cats somewhere in the distance. It was difficult to make out, but it appeared there was some large vent there, spewing the brown gas into the air. I guess it's a natural phenomenon. It all comes from the ground. Should I check it out? Judging from everything he'd seen to that point, not only was the substance not harmful to him, it was beneficial even. If he approached, he might find something interesting there, or at least he'd get a better taste of the strawberry vapor. But it's going to be a pain to navigate out of it. In the end, he decided to circle around it for now. He could consider returning later if he found nothing else. Shre. Hearing a shrill cry, he snapped his head to the right. A shadow was approaching rapidly, bringing up some bad memories. Not this again. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't outrun it, so he began blowing downwards to gain elevation. His only hope was to ascend high enough to lose it in the fog. However, the monster was getting closer much faster than he climbed. He'd never make it in time. A few seconds later, he could already make out its features. It was a fierce lizard-like creature, with its two forelimbs ending in large membranous wings. He thought he saw 3 ruby-like eyes glinting on its face too, and it was 5 times his size. Whatever, I guess it's another bust. Resigning to his fate, he stopped struggling after noticing the green core thrumming in the creature's frame. Yet, when he was sure the monster was about to pounce on him, something strange happened. It just circled around him, continuing on its way, ignoring him entirely. What's the deal with this place? Chapter 60 Docile. Beasts didn't just ignore tasty meals. Not all of them were cannibals, but if they encountered prey of a different species and a lower grade, their reaction was essentially set in stone. So, Percy had no clue why the flying lizard decided to spare him all of a sudden. Come to think of it, there was something off with its mana. He hadn't cared at the time, but the creature's core burned less intensely than it should for its size. The flow in its channels also appeared stilted and the color muted. Is it sick? Blind even? If it hadn't seen him nor used mana sense, it would explain how he got lucky. Then again, that didn't sound right. Percy was pretty sure the creature had gone out of its way to avoid him. Not attacking had been a conscious choice. Maybe everything here is docile. Could be something in the fog. His own species were the least aggressive beasts he'd ever seen, and they seemed to thrive off the substance. Either way, there wasn't enough data to tell for sure. In any case, Percy wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. Since he got a second chance, he resumed his journey, this time flying higher to more easily escape to the clouds in a pinch. A while later, he found something else worth noting. Splitting the plain in half, a river gushed through the stone. It was wider than the guild settlement, and he couldn't tell what lied at either end as it trailed off in the mist. He wasn't even sure if it was water flowing through it. The liquid was a light brown color. If it was water, it was polluted by the same substance permeating the air. Great! Progress! Percy's feline heart skipped a beat as he began tracing the river upstream. If this was drinkable, it should lead him to something alive sooner or later. And it turned out to be sooner. He didn't need to fly higher either, as the new creatures he ran into were land-dwellers this time. One was a mix between a praying mantis and a beetle. The other resembled a scaled leopard. Both were larger than him, glaring at each other with their 3 eyes, apparently getting ready to tear each other to shreds. Definitely not docile. Approaching them cautiously, he stopped just near enough to check out their cores. They were both at green, afflicted by the same ailment as the last beast. In fact, they had it even worse. A third of the leopard's channels were completely inactive. On closer inspection, Percy saw the corresponding hind leg was half-rotten. The beast avoided leaning on it too, the paw being suspended an inch off the ground. The bug didn't look much better, its pathways also a patchwork of holes and dim links. Are my species the only ones immune to the fog? Thinking of something, he ascended to the clouds, looking for another of his kin. He flew above the first furball he saw before blowing air the other way, accelerating towards it. Slamming against his much smaller relative, he sent it flying downward. The creature didn't even resist, just passively letting him push it around. It took them a few more bumps and a couple of minutes to return to his previous location. The green-cored beasts were still trying to intimidate each other, but they had yet to make a move. Apparently, they judged they weren't in a good enough condition to fight. I'm sorry, pal. This is for science. Percy flashed the smaller furball an apologetic grin, before shoving it one last time towards the leopard. The much larger beast tilted its head, giving them both a curious look, but didn't do much else. It just allowed the cat to bounce off the ground right next to it, within striking distance even without touching it. Ok. So not only are we immune to the fog, it seems we're the only ones the other beasts won't attack. Are we poisonous or something? Then again, the leopard's reaction wasn't what he'd expect if a highly toxic creature brushed right next to it. It had merely eyed it in amusement before looking away. Maybe we just taste really bad. Shrugging, Percy continued following the river. He had yet to fully solve the mystery, but at the end of the day he didn't even know if it mattered. They didn't have the brown substance back on Remir, and even if they did, he couldn't exactly bring this body back with him. Took several more hours until he saw something new. However, This discovery truly made his breath quicken. For the first time in over 2 years, one of his clones stumbled upon sentient life. The village was small, the humble huts made of stone. Not the polished, enchanted sort he was used to, just rough chunks, stacked against each other to form the most rudimentary shelter. Whoever lived here was clearly primitive. And he did get a closer look at them soon enough. These people were mostly humanoid, although their skin was a richer pink. They also had 4 pointy ears and 3 eyes, one in the middle of their forehead, much like everything else in this world. At least they aren't naked. Not that the patches of beast skin they draped on themselves were particularly fashionable, but it was something. Percy internally debated how close he wanted to get to the natives. He wasn't sure if they'd be as indifferent towards him as the wild beasts. Not that it would be the end of the world if they killed him, but it had taken him nearly a dozen clones to find some semblance of civilization. He didn't want to miss learning something useful by being careless. Who knew how long it would be until he had another chance? Then again, do they even know anything? They can hardly build a house. In the end, he chose to err on the side of caution. He ascended to the clouds once more, before returning with another sacrificial furball to test the waters with. Approaching the village, he shoved the creature in there, this time prompting some exclamations and amused reactions from the crowd. Some pointed at him while a few chuckled or talked to one another. Percy figured they just weren't used to his species being so animated. All the ones he'd seen had been a lot more sluggish. Well, as long as they're not hostile, I don't care. Nobody moved to attack him or the one he'd tossed their way. A kid, a girl maybe, ran up to the furball as it bounced a few times on the ground. She watched it curiously before extending her hand to pet it, when an adult hurriedly grabbed her arm, shaking his head. He spoke a few words Percy didn't understand, before the girl nodded, continuing to stare at the creature from a distance. Touching us must be taboo. In any case, he'd confirmed it was safe, so he moved closer, inspecting the locals with mana sense. He spotted red, orange, and yellow cores, in approximately a 40-40-20 ratio. That made them a lot luckier than the people of Remir, as they got yellow cores twice as frequently. However, Percy didn't feel any envy towards them. Many of the older-looking folk were still at red. They don't have any means of advancement. They're stuck at whatever they were born with, and that wasn't even where the bad news ended. The villagers seemed to suffer from the same condition as the beasts, all their cores appearing somewhat dysfunctional. The kids had it a bit better than the adults, reinforcing Percy's guess that the ailment was brought on by their chronic exposure to the fog. I guess the reason we're held at such a high esteem is because we purify the air, making things easier for all the other creatures. Well, this was all fascinating and everything, but that still didn't answer the question of what he should do. One option was to accept that this clone was another dud and leave early. He'd already spent several hours traveling here, and it didn't look like these people had much to give him. But he was disinclined to pick this. While wasting time was something he generally preferred to avoid, this was his first time finding sentient life since Huehue. Even though this particular village didn't seem to contain anything valuable, it did raise the worth of the clone in his eyes. At least, his last 10 or so clones hadn't lived half as long or found anything remotely as interesting. Even if he spent a few days longer than expected, it wouldn't hurt the main body much. Ok, I'll keep going. But do I stay in this village or try looking for a bigger one? Percy doubted the 40 or so people here were the entirety of their species. There were bound to be more out there. That said, he had no idea where to find them, or if they'd have anything more useful. Let's observe them for one full day. If I can't find anything worth my time, I'll head out.